It began with the sound of metal against stone, a dull clang that echoed strangely beneath the monastery, followed by the low murmur of men who had been working in silence for hours. It was February, cold even underground, and the renovation crew had been clearing centuries of debris to reinforce the foundation. No one expected to find anything more than old bricks and forgotten wine casks. But then, one of the men's hammers struck something that rang differently. Hollow, deliberate. They cleared the wall inch by inch. Dust clouded the narrow corridor, settling in their hair, their lungs. A faint draft began to seep through the crack they'd opened, dry and cold, the kind of air that hasn't moved for centuries. When the last stone gave way, the beam of a flashlight fell on a surface unlike the rest of the cellar. Iron. An ancient door. Reinforced with bands darkened by rust, the seams sealed with hardened wax. The workers didn't understand what they were looking at. Some joked that they'd found a medieval wine vault. Others thought it was a burial chamber sealed long ago and best left untouched. But as they brushed away the residue, their lights caught the shapes pressed into the wax. Symbols, unfamiliar and sharp-edged, circling a seal that no one could read. It wasn't Latin, nor any crest belonging to the monastery. It was something else entirely. At first, the foreman ordered them to stop. He called the project's supervisor, who in turn notified the Historical Preservation Office. Yet even as they waited for officials to arrive, curiosity pulled at them. One of the men pressed his ear to the iron and swore he heard something on the other side. Not sound exactly, but the hum of empty space, vast and waiting. By nightfall, the decision was made to open it. A camera was brought down to record the process, more for documentation than anticipation. No one believed they were about to make a discovery. They thought it would be another sealed cellar, another story for the local paper. But when the lock gave way, the first breath that escaped from the chamber carried a scent that froze them all in place. Parchment, wax, and something faintly metallic. Like the memory of blood. Their lights flickered across the room, and what they saw silenced even the jokes. There were no relics, no coins, no sarcophagi. The chamber stretched deep into the rock, lined with shelves carved directly into the stone. And on those shelves, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of leather-bound manuscripts. Each identical in size, each tagged with symbols written in the same ink-black hand. Not one was covered in dust. It was as if they had been placed there yesterday, and the world above had simply forgotten to look. Experts would later confirm that the room had been sealed for more than 700 years. Its architecture predated the monastery itself. Whoever built it had done so with precision and purpose, hiding not valuables, but information. Not to preserve it, but to keep it from ever being seen again. And that is what unsettled the historians most, because medieval institutions were masters of record-keeping. They documented, they copied, they preserved. But this was curation in reverse, a deliberate act of concealment, a silent decision about what the future should never know. When word reached the church authorities, access to the site was immediately restricted. The workers were dismissed, the chamber sealed again until an investigative team could arrive. But by then, photos had already been taken, images leaked, and the world caught a glimpse of something that was never meant to resurface. What the construction workers found behind that wall wasn't gold or jewels. It was something the church had tried to erase from existence for 7 centuries. And now, those secrets are out. As the vault door creaked open for the second time, this time under camera light, the lens captured the beginning of a revelation that would ripple through universities, archives, and faith itself. The story of what those manuscripts contained would soon reach far beyond Prague. But for now, in that silent chamber beneath the earth, history was holding its breath. The chamber was colder the second time they entered. The air hung thicker, touched by centuries of stillness. At the center stood a long wooden table, its surface scarred but sturdy, a relic waiting for purpose. Around it gathered the first team of historians and archivists, 8 in total, led by Dr. Helena Vavra, a scholar whose life had been spent studying monastic records. She had opened countless manuscripts before, but never one sealed behind iron and wax. She approached the nearest shelf as if entering a chapel. Each manuscript was bound in dark leather, the spines unmarked except for tiny inscriptions, numbers, and sigils pressed into the hide. Dust clung to everything else in the vault except these. It was as though someone had wiped them clean before closing the door for the final time. When Dr. Vavra chose the first volume, her hands trembled. The binding resisted, as if reluctant to be disturbed. Inside, the pages were brittle yet beautifully preserved. The ink a faded brown that still carried the impression of deliberate, steady handwriting. She read the first lines in silence. Then she stopped, exhaled, and whispered, "These aren't records. They're confessions." The manuscript detailed executions, names, dates, and accusations, but none appeared in any known chronicle. The crimes listed were strange, speaking of the light beneath the altar, preserving forbidden herbs, denying the silence of the moon. Each entry ended with the same signature, a bishop's seal, replicated across dozens of pages. The second volume was worse. It contained letters, personal correspondences between high-ranking clergy. The language was formal but edged with fear. They spoke of miracles staged to maintain authority, relics deliberately fabricated, and excommunications issued not for heresy, but for truth-telling. Each letter carried a postscript written in the same cautious hand, "Burn after reading." Yet none had been burned. Someone had kept them. Someone had known their importance. The third manuscript read like a ledger of nightmares. Anatomical drawings, measurements, and procedures. Experiments on the sick and the condemned, recorded not by physicians but by monks. Treatments involving mercury, powdered bone, and rituals that blurred the boundary between medicine and invocation. For centuries, such horrors had been dismissed as myth. Here they were methodically documented. Dr. Vara moved through the shelves slowly, cataloguing, breathing carefully, as though any sudden motion might disturb the fragile equilibrium of the room. The collection was impossibly deliberate, grouped by theme, labeled with care. Someone, or perhaps several someones, had spent decades compiling these texts. They hadn't been discarded in shame or hidden in panic. They had been arranged like evidence. Soon, analysts joined the effort. Samples of parchment and ink were sent to laboratories across Europe. Carbon dating confirmed what instinct had already suggested. The manuscripts were authentic, spanning more than 2 centuries of origin. The earliest dated to the late 1200s, the newest to the mid-1500s. linguistic specialists detected shifts in tone and dialect, proof that multiple authors had contributed over generations. And yet, across the differences, there was one unifying intention: preservation through secrecy. It became clear this was no random cache. It was an archive of omission, a mirror held up to history's blind spots. For every official decree that celebrated virtue, here was its shadow, evidence of manipulation, cruelty, and control. Every page implied a silent question. How much of what we call truth was carefully edited to fit the story the church wished to tell? When news of the discovery reached the outside world, the response was immediate and divided. Some hailed it as the greatest historical revelation of the century. Others called it blasphemy, insisting the manuscripts must be forgeries. But the physical proof was irrefutable. The ink was old. The fibers of the parchment bore the unmistakable fingerprints of medieval craftsmanship. Even the binding thread matched those used in ecclesiastical scriptoria. By the third week, the team had catalogued 612 volumes. And then, on the lowest shelf, Dr. Vavra found something that didn't fit with the rest. A single booklet bound in lighter leather, thinner, unnumbered. Its cover bore only one Latin phrase etched into the surface with surgical precision: Peccata silentium. Inside was not a narrative, but a list. 10 headings written in bold black ink, each followed by lines of numbers that corresponded to manuscript codes. It was unmistakably an index. But the categories were unlike anything found in a library. Deceptione sacra, manipulatio populi, experimenta in carcere, oracula fabricata cultus interni. Beneath each, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of references. It was a roadmap, guiding anyone brave enough to trace the church's unspoken history. An organized confession of collective guilt. Among the documents was something that looked like a medieval table of contents. But instead of chapter titles, it listed sins. Not personal sins, institutional ones. And each entry referenced dozens of supporting documents. For the scholars standing in that cold chamber, realization came slowly and without triumph. The vault was not built to protect knowledge. It was built to bury it. And in their hands now lay the index to everything that had been meant to disappear. They didn't destroy the evidence. They preserved it. Because in their theology, lying to God's record was worse than lying to people. They just made sure the people would never see it. To understand the vault, we must understand the world that created it. A world built not on open truth, but on carefully managed belief. In the Middle Ages, knowledge was a form of power as tangible as land or gold. The church and the crown shared a silent pact. Control information, and you control reality. But even within that hierarchy, there were levels. What the masses heard from the pulpit was only one layer. Behind that came the restricted chronicles, knowledge reserved for scholars, clergy, and nobility. And beyond those, the final layer, hidden even from most within the church itself. Archives like this one, where forbidden truths were recorded only so they could be locked away. It was not ignorance they feared, it was disillusionment. Medieval faith depended on the idea that authority was sacred, that leaders were vessels of divine will. But what happens when people learn that those vessels are cracked? That miracles can be manufactured, sins traded for silver, or science condemned only because it threatens control? Such knowledge could unravel the entire order. And so, the solution was paradoxical. They could not erase what they had done. Too many witnesses, too much guilt. Yet to confess publicly would mean collapse. The compromise was theological. Record the truth, not for men, but for God. Preserve the evidence for the final judgment, when all things hidden would be revealed, but ensure that no mortal eyes would see it before then. The vault was less an archive, and more a confession booth built for institutions rather than souls. What makes this revelation chilling is how deliberate it all was. The manuscripts weren't scattered or hidden in panic. They were catalogued, indexed, even cross-referenced. The act of concealment was performed with the same devotion as prayer. It implies not a cover-up in the modern sense, but a belief system, a doctrine of selective truth. And perhaps most unsettling of all, this practice wasn't isolated to Prague. Across Europe, fragments of similar structures have been rumored for decades. Sealed room beneath cathedrals, false walls behind abbey libraries, foundations built over what earlier generations chose to hide. The existence of this vault doesn't just rewrite one monastery's history. It hints at a network, a methodology, a quiet consensus among the powerful that the world is safer when truth sleeps unseen. Yet, as we look deeper, the question becomes uncomfortably modern. If leaders today had the same ability to bury their misdeeds for 7 centuries, would they hesitate? If they believed their actions could be hidden until all witnesses were gone, would morality change its meaning? History, it seems, is not only what we remember, it's also what someone long ago decided we should forget. The vault beneath the monastery is more than a relic of secrecy. It's a mirror reflecting the timeless urge of power to curate reality itself. And the farther we follow its trail, the more we realize this isn't just a story about the past. It's a warning about the present. As we turn the pages of the Peccata Silentium and open the first category listed within its index, the true weight of those sins begins to surface, scandals so carefully buried that even whispering them once meant death. The vaults contained inventory lists, not for church supplies, for fake relics, complete with pricing, production numbers, and notes on which saints' remains were selling best that season. At first, the historians thought they were reading ordinary procurement records, ledgers detailing shipments, storage, and parish distribution. But the deeper they read, the more grotesque the reality became. These weren't logs of devotion, they were receipts of deception. In one ledger from the early 1300s, under the insignia of the Benedictine order, was a column labelled Fragmenta Cruciae Vere, fragments of the true cross. Next to it, quantities, shipment routes, and margins. The total number of recorded pieces, if assembled, could have built not 1 but 20 complete crosses. The handwriting was neat, the calculations meticulous. The entry ended with a chilling line. Quality consistent with prior batch, oak of appropriate age and weight. Further records describe the manufacture of saints' relics on what could only be called an industrial scale. Beneath the monastery's workshops, craftsmen shaped splinters, bones, and cloth into items meant to evoke holiness. Animal blood was mixed with resins to prevent decay, sealed into vials labeled Sanguis Sancti Petri or Beatae Mariae. The recipes were written like alchemical formulas, balancing deception with durability. The documents even listed the sources of raw materials. Bones from butchered livestock, linen from discarded altar cloths, fragments of timber pulled from condemned buildings, and purified through prayer. There were entire pages dedicated to color instructions. How to darken wood with ash to mimic age. How to stain cloth to suggest the wear of the centuries. This was no rogue operation. The records bore episcopal seals and shipping permissions. Routes were mapped from Prague to Avignon, from Venice to Canterbury. Pilgrims would travel for weeks to see these relics, dropping coins into the coffers of monasteries that had perfected the art of selling faith itself. Among the more disturbing documents were letters between bishops debating the morality of the trade. One argued that these objects, though false, served a righteous end, for they strengthened belief and funded the missions of Christ's house. Another wrote with visible distress, calling it a commerce of the damned. But his objections ended there. No action was taken. The next page was a purchase order. Perhaps the most heartbreaking example came from a case study buried among the files. The testimony of a peasant family from Moravia. The father, a miller, had sold his entire harvest to purchase a fragment said to be from St. Agnes's veil, promised to cure his wife's fever. The document revealed that the so-called relic had been manufactured 3 weeks earlier in a monastery workshop 2 provinces away. The woman died before the relic arrived. The monks recorded the sale as successful. The papers described a structured hierarchy behind the fraud. Monks acted as artisans, bishops as distributors, merchants as couriers. Each relic type had a price index. A drop of a saint's blood was worth thrice the value of a splinter of the cross. Fabric touched to a martyr's tomb fetched more than teeth or bone unless accompanied by a story of suffering. The archives even contained seasonal sales notes. Increase production before Lent. Demand high during plague years. For centuries, believers knelt before these objects, seeking miracles, forgiveness, protection. The irony is painful. They received not divine intercession, but human craftsmanship, polished into sanctity. And behind it all was a machinery that thrived on desperation. The poorer the people, the greater their faith. The greater their faith, the easier the sale. One particular document, dated 1347, marked the darkest point in the relic economy. Europe was being consumed by the Black Death. Fear swept through every village, every church. Demand for holy protection skyrocketed. The document, a memo written in coded Latin, bore the seal of an archbishop. It read, "Increase relic output by 3-fold. Simplify sanctification process. People perish faster than we can comfort them." In the margins, a note, likely from a subordinate, dadded in a hurried hand, "Begin shipment of St. Sebastian arrows. High demand." Promised immunity to plague. For historians, this was the moment the illusion shattered completely. It wasn't faith guiding these decisions. It was economics dressed in vestments. The church's power was not only spiritual, but commercial. Its moral authority balanced against profit margins. The most haunting aspect wasn't the forgery itself, but the precision of its management. Quality checks, pricing adjustments, and even counterfeit authenticity seals, all were accounted for. Each relic came with a parchment of validation stamped by a local bishop, confirming miraculous origin. The deception was systemic, sustained, and sanctified. And yet, amid the revulsion, there was something deeply human about it. These records revealed fear. The fear of losing control, of failing to comfort the dying, of watching faith collapse under the weight of reality. The relics were lies, but they were lies told in the name of survival, spiritual, political, and economic. Still, the moral arithmetic remained impossible to justify. For every bishop enriched, 1,000 peasants were impoverished. For every relic sold, another person's trust in salvation was quietly exploited. The trade in false relics wasn't an anomaly. It was an empire built on belief. And when the Black Death ended, the ledgers didn't stop. The numbers simply returned to normal. As we turn to the next chapter of the vault's revelations, the pattern grows darker. The relic trade may have been profit-driven, but some secrets weren't about money at all. They were about silence, about power protecting itself at any cost. One manuscript contained a phrase that appears over 40 times across different documents. Pro bono ecclesiatis nas suas for the good of the church. It became clear that this was no blessing, but a code. Each time those words appeared, the text that followed described an act of concealment. The vault's most unsettling discovery was not its tales of greed or forgery, but of silence. Within dozens of volumes lay a bureaucracy of protection. Pages where crimes were recorded not to seek justice, but to ensure they remained unseen. The handwriting varied, the centuries shifted, yet the pattern never changed. Allegations were made, investigations opened, and then transfers approved. One file from 13 detailed the case of a parish priest accused by several families of unholy conduct with the young. The bishop's notes were coldly administrative. Investigate discreetly. Remove to Moravia. Assign penance of fasting. Weeks later, another entry in a different ledger confirmed the man's new appointment. His past erased with a single line. Pro bono ecclesiae. Across generations, the same rhythm repeated. Accusation, reassignment, penance, repetition. In some cases, the same names resurfaced decades apart, serving in new towns under new titles. The records show no outrage, only management. It was as though the church had created an internal circuit, a system designed not to confront corruption, but to redirect it elsewhere. The historians who read these pages did so in silence. The air in the chamber seemed heavier, the words themselves reluctant to be spoken aloud. No one had expected the vault to contain proof of such moral inversion. A faith built on confession using secrecy as its confessional. Letters between bishops revealed the reasoning. Some argued that public scandal would harm the faithful and imperil souls already fragile from doubt. Others cited scripture, insisting that judgment should be left to divine mercy, not secular courts. Forgiveness, they claimed, could redeem even the gravest sinner, so long as the sinner remained within the fold. Yet behind the pious language lay fear. Fear of shame, fear of collapse, fear of losing control over the narrative of holiness. One correspondence, dated 1428, between two archdeacons discussed whether civil authorities had any right to prosecute clergy. The reply was curt. No lay hand may punish the anointed. Only the church may cleanse its own. The attached tribunal record showed what that cleansing meant. The accused confessed. He was ordered to spend a month in prayer and then reassigned to a parish across the river. The victims were not mentioned again. The tribunal files followed a chilling consistency. Offences were classified by type: and assigned penance like fines on a ledger. For theft, return of goods. For blasphemy, fasting. For violation of innocence, silence and transfer. The process appeared less about justice than containment, as if sin could be managed like property, moved from one boundary to another. Among the manuscripts was a parchment covered in marginal notes, likely by a frustrated scribe. Between the lines of official language, he had written a question. Who confesses for the shepherds? His words were small, almost hidden beneath ink corrections, but they pierced through the centuries with unbearable clarity. The vault also contained testimonies, letters from those who had tried to speak. One, written by a young priest named Brother Thomas, described his attempt to report misconduct to his superior. He was summoned the next day, reprimanded for disrupting unity, and told that obedience was holier than truth. In his final entry he wrote, "I am to be transferred. They say it is for my safety. I fear it is for my silence." His handwriting stopped abruptly mid-sentence. There was no further record of him. Reading these accounts, modern historians faced an impossible balance. How to reveal truth without repeating harm? Each line was a wound preserved in ink. Every signature was a reminder that institutions can sin collectively, even while preaching redemption individually. The phrase pro bono ecclesi threads through centuries like a confession whispered too often. It turned forgiveness into a shield and mercy into a weapon. Those who believed they were protecting the church from scandal were, in truth, protecting predators from consequence. And the victims, unnamed, uncounted, were left behind in the margins of history, where empathy seldom reaches. It is easy to imagine these acts as relics of a darker age. Yet the mechanisms they reveal are disturbingly familiar. The reflex to preserve reputation, the instinct to silence the uncomfortable, the illusion that truth can be delayed until it is safe. The vault simply exposed the pattern in its purest form, stripped of centuries of justification. By the time the team finished cataloguing the final tribunal file, the weight of what they'd uncovered felt almost unbearable. They weren't just reading history, they were witnessing the anatomy of denial itself, constructed, documented, and preserved in the name of holiness. And still, within that same vault, among the signatures of bishops and abbots, a few dissenting voices appear. Anonymous scribes who left quiet questions in the margins. Words like "this cannot please God." Tiny acts of rebellion written in fading ink, waiting 700 years to be heard. As the pages close on this chapter, the focus shifts from the crimes themselves to those who enabled them, the ordinary men who convinced themselves obedience was virtue and silence was faith. One bishop wrote in his personal diary, "I pray God forgives what I must do for his church." The next page details relocating an accused priest to a new parish. He saw no contradiction. Among the vault's pages, the most disturbing revelations weren't always the crimes themselves, but the tone in which they were recorded. Most of these documents were not the confessions of villains, but the paperwork of administrators. Neat handwriting, dated entries, precise signatures, evil reduced to clerical duty. The language was eerily consistent, procedural, bureaucratic, void of emotion. When describing deception or concealment, the writers used phrases like resolution achieved, matter concluded, situation contained. Words that belonged to account ledgers, not moral reckonings. It was as if wrongdoing had been translated into a dialect of efficiency. The profiles emerging from these records were not of monsters, but of men convinced they were maintaining order. One bishop, celebrated for his sermons on honesty and virtue, managed the production of false relics with the same care he used to compose homilies. In his notes, both activities appeared under the heading Works of Service. To him, preserving faith, even through deceit, seemed an act of devotion. A monastery and treasurer meticulously balanced two ledgers side by side. One tracking proceeds from fraudulent relic sales, the other detailing donations to orphanages and alms for the poor. In his closing summary, he wrote, "Funds redistributed according to divine intention." To modern eyes, it reads as hypocrisy. To him, perhaps, it was harmony. Then there was the secretary whose handwriting filled entire volumes of tribunal reports. His annotations alternated between lists of candles as ordered for mass and records of abuse accusations. The same ink, the same tone. He wasn't cruel, just conditioned, trained to see morality as paperwork. The vault even contained training manuals for young clerical administrators, handbooks that read like early public relations guides. They instructed how to manage sensitive situations and protect the faith from scandal through discretion. Scandal, the manuals made clear, wasn't kaisunda. It was exposure. The sin was letting the illusion fracture. Yet, amid this machinery of justification, faint human hesitation occasionally bled through. A margin note beside a transfer order read, "May God judge me more kindly than men." Another letter, unsigned, admitted, "I do not sleep well. I tell myself this serves heaven, yet I no longer feel close to heaven." These were brief sparks of conscience in an ocean of obedience. Reading them, the historians felt a strange sorrow. These weren't cartoon villains. They were ordinary believers, caught inside a moral labyrinth built by their own institution. They obeyed because obedience was sanctified. They concealed because truth, once public, was considered more dangerous than lies maintained in secret. Their loyalty wasn't to corruption, it was to stability, to the church's survival, to an order they could not imagine existing without. That is perhaps the most haunting revelation of all. The system sustained itself not through overt malice, but through normalization. Wrongdoing became routine. Paperwork became penance, and personal morality was quietly set aside in favor of institutional preservation. When everyone is responsible, no one feels guilty. The bishop's diary captures this contradiction with chilling clarity. Written in elegant Latin, it alternates between prayers and directives. One page pleads for God's mercy, the next lists priests to be reassigned for indiscretions. His faith seems sincere. His blindness complete. To him, both pages serve the same purpose, protecting the church. And perhaps that is the deeper tragedy. Systems of faith or power rarely endure because of cruelty alone. They endure because ordinary people convince themselves their small compromises are righteous. The vault forces us to confront that evil rarely announces itself. It signs forms, stamps approvals, and prays afterward. With the ecclesiastical scandals laid bare, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Wherever unchecked power collects, concealment follows. And beyond the cloisters and cathedrals, another world was building its own archives of deception. The royal courts, where faith gave way to ambition, and secrecy became an art form. Buried in the accounts from a Florentine banker were payments to special consultants. The amounts were enormous. The vault documents revealed what service these consultants provided, making people disappear. It was in these ledgers that the historians first glimpsed the quiet machinery of royal violence. Assassinations wrapped in etiquette, murders disguised as governance. For centuries, chroniclers wrote of divine right and noble duty, but the papers hidden beneath the monastery told another story entirely. Power maintained not by lineage, but by elimination. The first manuscript translated came from 1386, a fragile record marked with the crest of the Hungarian royal court. Official histories claim that Prince Istvan of Transylvania died of fever that spring. Yet here the entry was unambiguous. Administered tincture in morning broth, witnessed cessation within 2 hours. The note bore the seal of the prince's uncle, Duke Laszlo, who ascended to power within a fortnight. Marginalia from a clerical observer added simply, "May God forgive the necessity." The vault was filled with such necessities. Letters between noble houses discussed death with the same tone used for grain shipments. The messenger delivered satisfaction. One count wrote to another, payment to be settled before feast day. It wasn't bloodlust, it was logistics. These documents revealed an economy of erasure. Assassins were often clerks, physicians, or household staff, people who could kill quietly and wrap it with precision. Poisons disguised as medicine, hunting accidents designed with flawless choreography, sudden illnesses that struck only the inconvenient. There were formulas for each. One letter from 1312 described an elaborate plot in France. A baron named Etienne de Roux had challenged his cousin's claim to an estate. The cousin, fearing scandal, enlisted allies to construct a fiction. Etienne was reported to have drowned while hunting swans. The official investigation produced witnesses, signed statements, even a recovered tunic from the river, all fabricated. The truth, recorded in the vault's hidden files, was simpler. Etienne had been smothered in his sleep by servants who were later rewarded with land grants. The forgeries were so effective that no historian ever questioned them, until now. This pattern repeated across kingdoms. A Bohemian count poisoned at communion, his death attributed to divine punishment. A Venetian envoy who vanished en route to Florence, his belongings catalogued as lost property. Each death smoothed a path, silenced a rival, stabilized a throne. Murder wasn't an aberration, it was policy. The vault even preserved the language of justification. A memorandum written by a royal chaplain advised that removing threats before they blossom prevents greater sins. The phrase appeared again in later documents, evolving into a doctrine. That certain killings could be righteous if they preserved order. Kings confessed not the deed, but the public lie that followed. To them, concealment was an act of mercy, shielding the realm from chaos. What the modern reader finds most shocking is the casualness of it all. These were not secret letters hidden in shame. They were copied, filed, and archived. Nobles sent updates about completed assassinations alongside notes on harvests and wedding plans. The line between moral and administrative duty had all but vanished. A collection of correspondence from Florence in the mid-1400s painted perhaps the clearest picture of this intertwining of commerce and death. Bankers maintained ledgers that included mysterious payments to consultants, identified only by initials. Each transaction carried coded annotations, D3 completed, R2 delayed, a waiting physician. At first glance, these looked like trade shipments, but cross-referencing with death records from the same months revealed an uncanny match. Every completion coincided with the sudden demise of a political rival. One ledger contained the names of 12 targets. 9 marked completed. 2 postponed. 1 left blank. Beside it, a chilling marginal note in faint ink. No longer necessary. Succumb naturally. Even death by coincidence had been audited. The deeper the historians read, the clearer the structure became. These weren't isolated crimes. They formed a pattern of sanctioned forgetting, a collaboration between courts, scribes, and chroniclers. For every assassination, an equal effort went into crafting the myth that replaced it. Whole generations were trained to repeat the fiction until memory itself obeyed. And through it all, the justification remained unchanged. That power must appear pure even when secured through blood. Medieval rulers didn't see themselves as murderers, but as custodians of divine order. To them, the truth was a luxury the realm could not afford. In the quiet light of the vault, those illusions crumbled. The letters and ledgers told their story plainly, of kings who ruled through erasure and scribes who turned death into documentation. Political murder, it turned out, was not the exception to medieval rule. It was one of its instruments. Yet, as the historians would soon discover, blood was only one currency of power. Lies, it seemed, were the more profitable one. The vault contained what one historian called the real royal family trees, showing actual ancestry alongside the official fabricated versions. For some families, they looked nothing alike. Among the most astonishing discoveries were stacks of genealogical charts bound in fine parchment, their ink still visible after centuries. At first glance, they appeared to be ordinary dynastic records, lineages tracing kings, dukes, and queens back to mythic ancestors. But in the margins, written in smaller, sharper hands, were quiet corrections and coded notes, strengthened, clarified, confirmed through discovery of evidence. Only later did the historians realize what those euphemisms meant. Strengthened meant falsified, clarified meant invented, and confirmed through discovery of evidence meant the evidence itself had been fabricated. The vault revealed that royal legitimacy in the Middle Ages was often less a matter of blood than of paperwork. When power depended on ancestry, those without the right ancestors simply created them. In one set of Spanish manuscripts, a family claiming descent from Visigothic nobility appeared to have manufactured its entire pedigree. The vault contained earlier drafts of their family tree, where the name stopped at a modest landholder in the 12th century. Later versions extended that line backward by 3 generations, complete with invented marriages, heraldic symbols, and charters proving noble status. Carbon dating confirmed those charters were produced nearly 50 years after the events they described. The supposed ancestors had never existed. The documents even recorded the mechanics of the deception. A royal advisor commissioned monks from a monastery near Burgos to rebuild family history in exchange for patronage. Their instructions were meticulous. Insert names into baptismal records, adjust burial lists, and claim the discovery of lost charters found behind the altar. The monks complied, crafting a lineage as solid on parchment as it was hollow in reality. This was not an isolated case. Across Europe, the same techniques appeared again and again. Forged birth records, altered chronicles, and letters rediscovered at moments of political need. In one English example, the vault preserved 3 drafts of a property charter tied to a ducal estate. The handwriting analysis revealed something extraordinary. 3 different scribes, from 3 different decades, had worked on it. Each generation had quietly modified the document to maintain its relevance. The final version bore signatures of men who had been dead for 60 years. Such manipulations were not crimes in the modern sense. They were acts of political craftsmanship. Legitimacy was a currency, and its mint was the written word. A single forged charter could transform a pretender into a prince, or erase a rival's claim entirely. The vault's records show that kings and their advisors debated fabrications like military strategies. In one correspondence between French courtiers, a secretary proposed tracing their queen's ancestry back to an obscure biblical lineage, that she may appear chosen by God's own pattern. Another counselor replied, too remote to be believed. Perhaps Roman descent would better suit her image. The cynicism was breathtaking, but so was the sophistication. The forgeries were designed with care, aged with smoke, written on parchment recycled from genuine medieval documents, and sealed with wax made to mimic century-old compositions. Some of these falsifiers were professionals, craftsmen of deception who moved quietly between monasteries, leaving behind immaculate lies. The vault named several by their trade rather than name: Scriptor Antiquarius, Fabricator Genealogiarum. They were the architects of royal truth. For all their deceit, these forgers possessed extraordinary skill. Their forgeries fooled scholars for centuries, because they understood not only ink and parchment, but psychology, the need of every society to believe its rulers are chosen by destiny, not opportunism. By manipulating the past, they engineered faith in the present. One letter, written by a royal chronicler to his patron, expressed the philosophy behind the practice. A kingdom's peace depends not on truth, but on order. The people must see unbroken lines, not the fractures we know. His words distilled the entire logic of medieval legitimacy. The truth was dangerous, coherence was sacred. The vault even contained evidence of double histories, families maintaining 2 genealogies. The public version displayed in courts, and the true lineage kept hidden in private chapels or vaults. In some cases, the 2 diverged so radically that the supposed founders of noble houses were strangers to their own descendants. Yet those same descendants still ruled, still bore titles that rested on paper scaffolds of invention. Perhaps the most unsettling realization came when modern genealogists compared these vault records to surviving aristocratic lines. Several prominent European families, still existing today, owe their social status to the very forgeries exposed here. Their entire legitimacy was a medieval construction that succeeded so completely it became reality. The implications reach beyond genealogy. The vault shows how history itself can be engineered, rewritten until the fiction becomes indistinguishable from truth. Power, once established on falsehood, does not collapse. It redefines reality around itself. The monks who forged documents may have believed they were serving divine order. The nobles who paid them believed they were safeguarding stability. Both were correct in their own way. The system endured precisely because it replaced doubt with narrative. Even now, reading these documents feels like watching the scaffolding behind a cathedral, the structure that holds up faith, but must never be seen. The royal lines we recite in history books are, in many cases, works of artifice so perfect They survived the scrutiny of centuries. The true miracle is not divine ancestry, but human fabrication carried out with conviction. The vault does not mock these deceptions. It reveals their necessity. For a world built on inheritance, truth was malleable clay, and the hands that shaped it belonged not only to kings, but to the scribes who decided which names deserved to live forever. And as those genealogies solidified, so too did power. Forged bloodlines became law, false origins became sacred, and the right to rule was no longer a matter of truth, but of who controlled the pen. Fraudulent lineage created dynasties. The next question was how those dynasties preserved themselves, by turning the very concept of justice into a tool of survival. One judge kept 2 sets of trial notes. The public record, formal, procedural, legally precise, and his private notes, which for one trial simply said, "The Duke wants him dead." Will proceed accordingly. The vault's legal manuscripts stripped away one of the Middle Ages' most persistent illusions, that justice, though primitive, was at least sincere. In reality, the documents showed courts functioning as stages. Trials were performances, verdicts written in advance, and the law itself a script rehearsed to give power the appearance of virtue. Among the first records examined was the case of a merchant tried in Prague in 1374 for fraud against the crown. The official transcript described a fair proceeding. Testimony, evidence, deliberation. Yet beside it lay a private letter from the presiding judge to his superior. He is blameless, but obstinate. His refusal to contribute to the noble fund requires demonstration. The demonstration came 2 days later, when the merchant was publicly hanged. The treasury ledger from the same month recorded his confiscated assets under the line item, "Justice received." These paired documents, the official and the private, exposed the structure of deception. Justice was not merely corrupted, it was engineered as spectacle. Torture chambers doubled as confession factories. Court scribes rehearsed testimony to match the predetermined verdict. Even the words of absolution, read before execution, were carefully timed for effect. One set of trial notes from Florence described an accused witch, a widow, of means, whose only crime was owning land her feudal lord desired. The court proceedings listed her unnatural speech and erratic behavior. But another file, found in the vault, contained the Lord's letter to the magistrate. Ensure conviction, but spare her suffering if she signs property transfer before sentence. She refused. The execution records marked her death as prolonged for penitence. Another case detailed a peasant revolt in 1411. 12 men were charged with theft, though the evidence pointed instead to their attempts to organize fair wages. In correspondence between local judges, one line stood out: "Make example before planting season, lest others forget their station." The hangings were scheduled at dawn in the village square. No theft was ever proven, but the harvest was completed without protest. The vault's records revealed that medieval law didn't fail by accident. It was designed to function differently for different people. Nobles faced ecclesiastical courts, where penance could replace punishment. Commoners faced civil courts, where guilt was presumed and fines or death preserved order. Inequality wasn't a flaw in the system, it was the foundation of it. Even some judges recognized the contradiction. In the margins of a trial manuscript, one hand had written, "I sign this with trembling." The man is innocent, yet my silence is required for peace. Another confessed privately, each verdict kills two, one in body, one in conscience. These traces of hesitation, small as they were, humanized the machinery of injustice. The judges were not monsters. They were participants in a ritual they no longer believed in, but lacked the power to refuse. The vault also held executioners' logs, grimly pragmatic records of services rendered. Payments were noted alongside requests from patrons. Some nobles asked for swift deaths, others for visible repentance, meaning longer suffering. So, one entry read, "Delay stroke until signal from steward. Audience not yet satisfied." Justice, once public, became theatre in the most literal sense. What made the performance convincing was its precision. The rituals of trial, the robes, the oaths, the seals, created an aura of divine order. To question verdicts was to question God's will. And so, the performance endured. For centuries, people believed in justice because it looked sacred. The performance of fairness replaced fairness itself. Perhaps the most cynical artifact found was a guide written for new magistrates. Bound in calfskin, titled "On the Art of Equitable Judgment." It was, in truth, a manual for manipulation. It instructed, first, know the desired end, then gather testimony to adorn it. The public must see procedure, not decision. In its closing line, the author offered what might be the truest description of medieval law. Judgment is not discovery, it is affirmation of power. The historians who uncovered these pages didn't read them with outrage, but with unease. The distance between then and now felt thinner than expected. The language of legitimacy, procedure, protocol, order remains familiar. The tools of power change shape, but the script endures. And as the vault's final judicial documents were catalogued, one truth became impossible to ignore. Medieval justice was not blind. It was choreographed. With church, crown, and court exposed as architects of illusion, the vault's focus shifted again to the final realm where knowledge itself was manipulated, medicine and science. There, deception wore a different mask, the mask of discovery. One physician kept meticulous notes on surgical experiments. His observations were scientifically detailed. His subjects were prisoners who hadn't consented and weren't anesthetized. He wrote, "The screaming complicates concentration." That line appears midway through a leather-bound volume dated to the late 13th century. Its pages read like modern clinical reports, methodical, structured, precise. But every sentence conceals human suffering. It was among the vault's most chilling discoveries. The documentation of medical experimentation carried out on those society had already decided were expendable. The opening pages catalogued test subjects by number, not by name. Columns listed age, gender, and condition at acquisition. Some were described as criminals awaiting execution, others as orphans, beggars, or the feeble-minded. To the physicians who recorded them, they were not patients. They were instruments, useful bodies from which knowledge could be extracted. A report from 1294 described a series of poison trials. Prisoners were deliberately given measured doses of toxic herbs and minerals, followed by attempted cures. The notes recorded pulse rates, color of skin, and time of death. In several cases, the treatment was applied only after fatal symptoms had already begun. The final line of one entry reads, Experiment unsuccessful. Subject expired. Noted useful pattern in vomiting sequence. Another set of manuscripts detailed surgical procedures tested on living subjects. Physicians practiced amputations, trepanations, and cauterizations on condemned criminals, arguing that since their deaths were inevitable, the suffering merely hastened the inevitable. Marginal notes included observations about muscle contractions, blood flow, and recovery times for those who survived. One physician, clearly aware of his cruelty, justified it in writing. Their pain is temporary, knowledge eternal. The theology of the age provided convenient justification. The Church had long taught that redemption could follow any sin, and that worldly suffering might purify the soul. Combined with medical ambition, this belief formed a grim equation. If pain cleansed the spirit, then inflicting pain for knowledge could even be seen as an act of service. The vault's correspondence between physicians and clerics echoed this rationalization again and again. Phrases like, "Better their bodies perish than the art of healing remain ignorant." Among the most disturbing materials were procurement ledgers. Institutions paid intermediaries for subjects, listing prices by age and condition. Orphans fetched lower rates, the sick slightly higher. One invoice from a monastic hospital recorded payment for 4 indigent males for test of purgative salts. Each entry ended with a note of thanks. May God bless this offering to knowledge. The correspondence between physicians revealed a hidden network. Letters exchanged across regions, sharing results, describing techniques, even sending what they called metrials. One physician in Bologna wrote to a colleague in Paris, "Enclosed the hearts of 2 subjects for comparative study, preserved in vinegar per instruction." The professionalism of the documentation made it more horrifying. There was no trace of sadism, only procedure. Every experiment was methodically logged. Objective, duration, conclusion. Some studies even used primitive control groups, comparing treated and untreated subjects, observing differentials of suffering. Modern historians noted the eerie similarity to the structure of later scientific reports. The difference lay not in method, but in morality. One letter stood out for its disturbing self-awareness. Written around 1307, a physician defended his actions to a critic who accused him of cruelty. 10 will suffer, and perhaps die, that 10,000 may live. Shall I then be condemned for the scale of my compassion? His argument echoes modern utilitarian logic, but in the context of the vault, it reads as a chilling inversion of mercy. Some documents hinted at resistance. A young apprentice wrote to his mentor, begging to be released from assisting in the trials. He confessed nightmares of those who died under his knife and concluded, "I cannot pray anymore." There was no reply preserved. But months later, a note in another volume listed his replacement. The anatomical drawings accompanying these records were exquisitely detailed. Muscles, organs, veins traced with remarkable accuracy. They revealed a genuine leap in medical understanding, bought at a cost no one was meant to count. The irony is unbearable. Many of the diagrams that shaped early surgery and anatomy may have originated in these secret experiments, yet their true sources were buried along with their victims. The vault's cataloguers handled these manuscripts differently from the rest. They did not photograph every page nor publish their contents in full. Out of respect, names that survived were redacted, though few existed. Most subjects were reduced to descriptions: male, 30, feverish before trial. The anonymity of their suffering seemed deliberate, part of the system itself. Erase identity, erase guilt. The wider culture accepted such cruelty, not because people were heartless, but because hierarchy made empathy selective. The poor, the condemned, the unwanted were already outside the moral perimeter. They existed in a twilight zone where theology and pragmatism met. Their lives deemed lesser, their deaths usable. The physicians who exploited them were products of that world, a world that measured worth not by humanity, but by utility. For modern readers, these records collapse the comforting distance between progress and barbarism. The logic used to defend the experiments, sacrifice a few to save many, still echoes faintly in our own age. What the vault revealed was not only the darkness of medieval medicine, but the recurring human temptation to justify cruelty in the name of knowledge. When the historians closed the final ledger, they did so in silence. Between its lines was a moral lesson older than science itself. Discovery without conscience is not advancement. It is repetition. And yet, as they would soon learn, cruelty was only one face of deceit. Beyond the hidden laboratories and broken bodies lay another realm of corruption, one less violent but equally destructive: the empire of medical fraud. During the worst plague year on record, one physician's income tripled. His private notes contain the phrase, "Effective treatments would bankrupt me." The vault's plague records offered a chilling inversion of compassion. Between 1347 and 1351, as Europe convulsed under the Black Death, physicians documented not only the collapse of life, but the expansion of business. While whole cities emptied, ledgers grew heavier. Hope became a commodity sold by those who knew it could not heal. Among the manuscripts were treatment guides filled with recipes for plague preventatives. They described intricate herbal concoctions, exotic ingredients, and rituals for purification. But beside these ornate prescriptions were marginal notes written in a physician's neat Latin hand. "I have tested none of this." Another added, "Composition arbitrary, price acceptable." The vault revealed a network of profiteers who coordinated prices across cities. Correspondence between physicians in Florence, Paris, and Prague discussed how to maintain parity in the cost of antidotes, ensuring the illusion of rarity. One letter advised, if the poor afford the cure, it loses its virtue. The recipients agreed to double prices during outbreaks, justifying the increase as the cost of scarcity. Their trade thrived on fear. Plague amulets, blessed powders, and tinctures of crushed jewels were sold at prices that destroyed families. Herbal sellers inflated the value of mundane ingredients by renaming them. Rosemary became dragon's leaf, garlic, sunstone root. The vault contained inventories from apothecaries who mixed ordinary vinegar with rosewater and sold it as purified elixir of divine protection. Some documents show an almost scientific cynicism. A physician from Avignon wrote to his colleague, "They crave complexity. Simple remedies inspire no faith. Add exotic dusts, vary color, and claim secret origin. The effect is in the price." The same letter included calculations of profit per treatment, organized like trade accounts. Not every physician was a villain. Some records suggest genuine confusion and desperation. Without understanding contagion, they grasped at superstition as medicine. Others convinced themselves that deception was mercy. One defended selling useless charms, writing, "If they believe they are safe, perhaps they shall die in peace." The vault revealed that for many, the line between delusion and fraud was thin and shifting. But the financial evidence told a simpler truth. In one Florentine archive, two columns faced each other on the same page: death recorded and income received. As the plague intensified, the deaths rose and so did the income. The more people perished, the richer the healers became. Records from Bologna described protective visits, where physicians claimed to examine plague victims, charging fees for their bravery. The vault's correspondence revealed those same doctors never entered infected homes. They sent assistance instead. One letter from 1349 reads, "Maintain distance. Display soot upon robe to suggest encounter. The smell of smoke pleases clients. They think it purifies." The deception extended to production. Workshops manufactured plague talismans in bulk, stamped with pseudo-religious symbols, then sold them individually as sacred relics. Some even produced counterfeit certificates of authenticity, signed by the fabricated ecclesiastical authorities. For the terrified populace, each amulet promised survival. For the physicians and merchants, each sale promised comfort of a different kind: financial security. Perhaps the most haunting text in this collection was a physician's reflection written near the epidemic's end. "I have lost count of the dead and of my earnings. It may be they are the same number. I tell myself that belief itself is medicine, though I no longer believe." That sentence captures the moral collapse of plague medicine. A world where knowledge failed and exploitation filled the void. Some justified their actions with theology, claiming that wealth gained through service to the suffering was divine reward. Others embraced pragmatism. If no cure existed, then selling hope was not deceit but business. Yet the vault's ledgers expose a grim arithmetic. In one town, the death toll rose by thousands, while profits of its medical guild tripled. The correlation was perfect, the morality inverted. Human despair had become an economic system. The plague profiteers did not create suffering. They refined it. They learned how to turn panic into income, ignorance into opportunity. And though the centuries have passed, their logic feels uncomfortably familiar. As the historians closed those pages, they were left with an answerable question. Which is more dangerous, the cruelty of those who exploit suffering, or the ignorance that allows it to flourish? For in the centuries that followed, medicine would evolve in method, but not always in honesty. The next revelations from the vault would expose not deliberate fraud, but something subtler and perhaps more insidious: the pretense of understanding in a world that understood nothing. One medical professor wrote 2 books in the same year. His public textbook described certain and effective treatments. His private journal contained the line, "Most of what I teach, I know to be false." The vault's final medical papers revealed something subtler than fraud or cruelty: a profession trapped between ignorance and authority. Medieval physicians projected certainty not because they believed in it, but because doubt was unaffordable. In a world terrified of illness, expertise itself was a form of currency, and uncertainty was bankruptcy. The gap between public confidence and private confusion was immense. Official treatises spoke of humors, astrological alignments, and divine will with absolute conviction. Yet, private letters whispered a different story. "The balance of humors is mystery," one physician wrote to another. "I prescribe what is expected, not what is proven. Another admitted, the stars give no answers, but men pay for certainty, not questions. Behind the facade of knowledge, there was quiet chaos. The vault's correspondence revealed physicians debating which ancient authorities to cite, not because they trusted them, but because citing the wrong one could end a career. A professor in Paris confessed in a private letter, "I have observed many recover without my medicines and many perish with them. Yet the texts command I teach their use." His next line captured the paradox of his profession: better to repeat error with confidence than to speak truth and lose students. Economic survival reinforced the illusion. Wealthy patrons demanded confidence, not candor. A physician who admitted uncertainty lost patients. One who projected mastery gained status. The system rewarded certainty over accuracy, performance over understanding. Medical schools and guilds institutionalized the deception, equating authority with infallibility. To question the old masters was to risk being labeled heretical, not just in faith, but in intellect. Some tried to resist. The vault included notes from private gatherings, small circles of practitioners who met in secret to share real observations. They compared symptoms, tested treatments, and admitted failure. These hidden societies, as historians called them, were embryonic forms of empirical science. Yet even they swore oaths of discretion. Their work was not to be published, only whispered. One letter closed with the warning, "We are not enemies of a knowledge, but its protectors. Truth must not yet be public." There was something tragically human in their duplicity. Many of these men genuinely sought to heal. They wanted to believe their knowledge had purpose. But the structures around them, the universities, the guilds, the courts, demanded certainty as proof of worth. To confess ignorance was to surrender authority, and so they buried their doubts in journals that no one was meant to read. Among the most haunting documents was the private reflection of an elderly physician near the end of his life. The pages were fragile, the ink faded, but his words endured. "I have spoken with the voice of confidence while trembling within. My cures were guesses, my faith a necessity. Perhaps I saved some through illusion. Perhaps I harmed more. I cannot tell." That confession stands as the quiet epilogue to medieval medicine, a reminder that deception does not always begin in greed or cruelty. Sometimes it begins in fear of irrelevance, of losing trust, of admitting the limits of human understanding. The vault's medical records closed with that question unresolved. Was the performance of knowledge a lie, or an act of mercy? As the candles burned low in the archive, the historians understood the pattern had come full circle. Power, whether religious, political, or scientific, always demands certainty. And where certainty cannot exist, illusion takes its place. Beyond the laboratory and the sick room, another stage awaited: society itself, where morality was preached as virtue and practiced as theatre. The vault contained expense records from a monastery famous for poverty vows. One line item, for maintaining prior's 3 households. Another, silencing the children's mothers, filed next to his sermons on chastity. The contrast was staggering. Among the vault's thousands of manuscripts, few carried as much quiet cynicism as the personal accounts and correspondence of those sworn to virtue. They revealed not isolated lapses, but a structure, an organized double life where sin was privately indulged and publicly condemned. At first, historians assumed they had found scattered scandals. A few corrupt abbots, the occasional indulgent bishop. But the more they read, the clearer the pattern became. Hypocrisy was not deviation from the system, it was part of its design. A series of ledgers from a monastery near Cologne documented purchases inconsistent with monastic poverty. Wine from Burgundy, silks from Venice, spices from Alexandria. The entries were disguised under categories like maintenance of holy table or liturgical materials. Yet cross-referencing these with local merchant accounts exposed the reality. The items were delivered to private residences belonging to the same monks who preached renunciation. One of the most celebrated preachers of asceticism, known for sermons warning against worldly temptation, kept a private account book listing expenditures that rivaled a nobleman's. Gold-threaded vestments, rare perfumes, imported tapestries, every luxury catalogued with precision. At the end of each month, a note appeared in his own handwriting, expenses justified as tools of inspiration. The vault's correspondence added further layers. Letters between abbots and local officials arranged discreet payments to prevent gossip, often labelled alms to protect the faithful. A bishop famous for defending marital fidelity maintained 3 separate families across 3 dioceses, each supported through carefully disguised diocesan funds. The letters coordinating these arrangements were written with the same bureaucratic tone used for church maintenance, cold, efficient, almost professional. Some monasteries institutionalized the cover-ups. Secret treasuries, arse tacite, held funds reserved for sensitivity expenses, meaning hush money. One document listed regular payments to taverns that provided companionship for monks under vow. Another recorded relocation stipends for women who had borne children by clergy, categorized as charitable relocation of vulnerable persons. What made these revelations especially disturbing was not simply the hypocrisy, but the intellectual framework used to justify it. Theological writings within the vault revealed arguments that public virtue mattered more than private purity. One abbot wrote, "It is better that the shepherd appear spotless than that the flock despair of holiness." Another defended his indulgence by claiming a man's weakness does not annul the truth of his teaching. Such rationalizations were rarely challenged. Correspondence between superiors discussed scandal management with the same detachment found in legal records. When misconduct risked exposure, the priority was always containment, never confession. One letter to a regional vicar advised, "Do not rebuke, reassign. Confession restores grace. Public knowledge destroys faith." The vault even contained confessional logs, handwritten notes from priests who heard the repeated admissions of their own superiors. One entry described a senior monk who confessed to the same sin, visiting brothels, over 20 times in 3 years. Each time absolution was granted, and each time the behavior resumed. There was no pretense of repentance, only ritual absolution maintaining appearances. Not all participants were comfortable. A single fragile parchment, written in trembling script, told the story of a young monk named Lucian. In a letter to a friend outside the monastery, he described discovering his abbot's hidden life, his mistress, his secret child, his luxurious meals consumed in private chambers. "I thought holiness was light," he wrote, but now I see it is shadow made bright by candles. Lucien's next appearance in the records came months later in administrative notes. Brother Lucien reassigned to silent penance for breach of obedience. His signature appears on later financial ledgers. By then, he was part of the same concealment system he had once condemned. These documents painted a world where faith and falsehood coexisted by necessity. Maintaining moral order required illusion. The higher the pedestal, the greater the shadow it cast. Hypocrisy wasn't only tolerated, it was strategically useful. Public virtue stabilized belief. Private indulgence was contained, not punished. The lesson is unsettling, but familiar. Institutions built on moral authority often protect appearances at any cost, convinced the image of purity serves the greater good. The vault merely stripped away the centuries, revealing a truth that never changed. When reputation becomes sacred, honesty becomes heresy. As the historians closed the last of the monastery records, one note in the margin lingered in memory. Written by an anonymous scribe centuries ago, it read simply, "All confess in secret. Only the honest do so aloud." The hypocrisy of the pious was personal, hidden behind cloistered walls. What followed was more public, more violent. The enforcement of morality upon others by those who privately defied it. The maid who sentenced 37 people for adultery kept a ledger, not of their sins, of those who paid him to avoid prosecution despite the same sins. His own mistress's name appears 4 times. The vault's records of moral enforcement exposed perhaps the most corrosive paradox of all. The guardians of virtue were, in practice, its most prolific violators. The very men tasked with preserving public morality treated sin not as transgression, but as opportunity. In medieval Europe, moral surveillance was an institution. Church investigators, civic inspectors, and guild officers roamed towns and villages enforcing codes that governed everything from sexual conduct to Sabbath observance. They possessed authority to fine, imprison, and publicly shame offenders. But the vault's internal correspondence shattered the illusion of impartial guardianship. Dozens of documents revealed these enforcers monetized their positions. The most damning came from a diocese in southern France, where an official overseeing cases of carnal sin ran what could only be described as a protection racket. His own notes recorded names of adulterers, amounts paid, and whether discretion was maintained. Those who could not pay faced prosecution and public humiliation. Those who could, often wealthier or more connected citizens, received forgiveness in advance, neatly documented under dispensations for charity. Letters exchanged between regional morality officers revealed the cynical precision of their operations. One wrote, "Adultery is plentiful this spring. I expect revenues to rise accordingly." Another responded, "Be cautious with widows. They pay poorly, but speak much." It wasn't justice. It was bookkeeping. The exploitation extended far beyond sexual misconduct. Guild enforcers tasked with maintaining trade standards accepted bribes to overlook inferior materials or mismeasured goods. One weaver fined for selling defective cloth was later revealed to have been targeted simply for refusing a payoff. The same enforcer had approved substandard work from his cousin's workshop the same week. Even more grotesque were the accounts from civic moral courts, where women accused of impropriety faced interrogation by officials who themselves sought sexual favors in exchange for leniency. The vault preserved testimony from a clerk who tried to expose such abuse. His written complaint ended abruptly. "I am warned to remember that judges too may judge me." His name disappeared from later records. The documents showed a world where morality functioned as commerce. Investigators kept lists of citizens' private behaviors: adulteries, debts, drunkenness, gossip. These were less moral ledgers than instruments of leverage. Offences were prosecuted only when profitable. Silence, too, had a price. One especially revealing set of letters circulated between a network of moral enforcement officials in the Rhineland. They shared advice on maximizing returns. One suggested setting seasonal quotas. During Lent, focus on tavern sins. After harvest, on gambling. Another described how to coordinate accusations so that punishments appeared impartial while targeting those unlikely to retaliate. They even discussed how to protect one another, promising mutual testimony if any faced exposure. The vault included correspondence between two senior investigators debating whether to prosecute a nobleman known for his debauchery. The decision was recorded succinctly. "He hosts us well. The matter rests." Behind the pious rhetoric, morality enforcement had become a shadow economy. Sin was currency, redemption a transaction, justice a performance. The ledgers made it painfully clear that enforcement was never about righteousness. It was about control and income. Psychologically, the pattern echoed what historians had seen in other institutions: compartmentalization. Some officers viewed their jobs as professions, not moral callings. They punished others as part of administrative duty, not conscience. One investigator wrote, "I correct others so they might fear sin. My own soul is between me and God." Others showed no trace of internal conflict. Predators in official robes, using divine authority as armor. The vault's final entry on this subject came from a dismissed morality officer who turned informant. His confession described a network so entrenched that exposure felt futile. "We are all bound by each other's guilt. To speak is to perish." For centuries, chroniclers praised moral courts for maintaining order. The vault revealed their true nature: a system where virtue was enforced by vice, and every accusation doubled as negotiation. The same hands that wrote sentences for others wrote exemptions for themselves. It was the logical extension of the hypocrisy uncovered in the cloisters. When institutions define morality, enforcement becomes a weapon, and the enforcers, immune to it, become its beneficiaries. The hypocrisy of individual priests and monks had remained private, hidden behind stone walls. But here, in the moral courts and city streets, hypocrisy became public policy. Communities lived under rules their own guardians ignored, punished for sins their judges committed nightly. And still, the story did not end with officials. The vault's next set of documents revealed a deeper form of collective deceit, when entire towns participated in public virtue while privately preserving their own secret indulgences. A city council document outlined their annual festival of virtue. The last page contained a note: public penance in morning, private indulgence by evening, as is custom. Of all the vault's discoveries, none captured the paradox of medieval life more perfectly than this one. It revealed not only individual deceit dulled, but collective performance. A society that turned morality into spectacle while privately thriving on the very sins it condemned. Across Europe, towns staged elaborate displays of righteousness. penitential processions where citizens marched barefoot in repentance. Morality plays dramatizing the triumph of virtue over vice, and public punishments designed to humiliate the wicked. Yet, beside these official records, lay quieter documents, letters, inventories, tavern ledgers, showing that behind the banners of holiness, the same towns indulged in every forbidden pleasure they denounced. One set of records from a Flemish port described a grand public ceremony banning gambling. The entire town gathered to watch dice burned in the square, a symbolic cleansing. But another ledger from the same month, kept by the local tavern guild, listed dice and cards replenished after festival. A marginal note from a clerk added wryly, "Officials favor the new ivory sets." In southern Germany, a city's morality council publicly paraded accused adulterers through the streets, forcing them to confess before crowds. Yet private correspondence between council members exposed their own affairs, carried out with mutual silence. "Let the crowd have its theatre," one wrote to another, "and we shall keep our peace." The vault contained evidence that even acts of censorship were performances. In 1472, a university town staged the public burning of immoral manuscripts. Days later, an inventory from a nobleman's estate listed several of those same titles, purchased directly from the officials who had condemned them. The hypocrisy wasn't hidden, it was ritualized. Everyone played their part. The psychology of such behavior was laid bare in letters exchanged between civic leaders. They openly discussed the gap between public morality and private practice. "The people require ceremony," one mayor wrote. "Faith must be seen, else disorder follows. Whether they believe is immaterial." Another agreed, "Virtue unperformed is invisible. Therefore, we act it." These festivals of morality served more than spiritual purpose, they reinforced hierarchy. The poor bore the burden of public shame, while the wealthy purchased discretion. Guilds and councils taxed the ceremonies, sold indulgences, and profited from the props of virtue. Theatres of repentance became economic events, sustaining the very institutions they pretended to purify. One particularly revealing set of documents detailed the planning of a city-wide morality festival. Budgets, scripts, and costumes were listed meticulously. But at the bottom of the final page, an annotation in smaller handwriting revealed the truth of its purpose. Intended chiefly to maintain proper appearance of virtue among merchants and officials. Another note, written later by a participant, admitted, by the second night, all returned to their habits. Yet the city slept easier, believing itself cleansed. It would be easy to condemn such duplicity, but the vault's documents suggest something more complex. Public virtue was not merely hypocrisy, it was social glue. The performance of morality maintained order, provided identity, and allowed contradiction to exist without collapse. The spectacle of goodness mattered more than goodness itself. Among the philosophical writings tucked within the same archive, one anonymous scholar asked a question that echoed through the centuries. If virtue must be acted to preserve peace, is it still falsehood or wisdom? The historians who read those lines realized the vault was not only exposing corruption, it was describing the human condition, the tension between who we are and who we must appear to be. And as the festival banners faded into memory, one truth remained constant. Society survives not on honesty, but on performance. The next revelation would explain how that performance endured for centuries, how secrets of this magnitude stayed hidden, protected by the machinery of silence itself. They found a training manual for church secretaries. It looked like basic administrative guidelines, until linguists realized every innocuous phrase had a second meaning, a complete language for documenting crimes without creating evidence. Among all the vault's revelations, none was more quietly devastating than the discovery of this coded bureaucracy, a system so effective that centuries of scandal could be hidden in plain sight. To the untrained reader, the documents appeared ordinary: letters, receipts, memoranda. But buried within their polite formality was an entire vocabulary of suppression. The pattern first emerged when a historian noticed unusual consistency in phrasing across unrelated institutions. Phrases like requires special attention, resolved privately, and handled according to tradition appeared in church royal begiladim and medical records spanning 200 years. At first, they seemed like bureaucratic habits, but when cross-referenced with documents describing the same events more candidly, their true meaning surfaced. Requires special attention meant silence. Resolved privately meant payment or intimidation. Handled according to tradition meant invoking a well-established cover-up procedure. What began as linguistic coincidence soon revealed itself as deliberate design. The vault contained actual glossaries, training documents prepared for new administrators, explaining the meanings of these phrases and how to apply them. They read like early manuals for institutional self-protection. When referring to matters of impropriety, one line instructed: avoid direct description. Employ recognized euphemisms to preserve dignity and continuity. These glossaries were astonishingly detailed. There were different codes for different dangers. Pastoral transfer could signify relocation of an accused cleric. Inheritance irregularity meant politically motivated death, medical advancement trial, concealed human experimentation. Even the choice of adjectives carried weight. Unfortunate circumstance meant scandal contained. Unforeseen event meant failure of suppression. The sophistication extended beyond vocabulary. The codes adapted to risk. When correspondence might be intercepted by rival powers, secondary layers of phrasing were used. Royal scribes wrote of unsteady lineage to describe illegitimate heirs. Church officials used personal penance to denote enforced disappearance. The system allowed for plausible deniability. Any outsider reading the documents would see only vague administrative caution, not conspiracy. Some of the most revealing artifacts were letters exchanged between institutions sharing code innovations. One church official wrote to a royal advisor, "Our recent terminology has served well. Suggest adoption of pastoral discretion instead of transfer, as the latter now draws attention." Another letter from a university dean advised colleagues to replace disciplinary review with academic reassessment after the previous term had become too transparent. It was a living language, constantly evolving to evade comprehension. The psychological dimension was just as significant. The use of neutral bureaucratic phrasing allowed participants to document immorality without confronting it. Writing "the matter has been privately concluded" was easier than writing "we have silenced the victims." The language itself became a form of moral insulation, turning atrocities into paperwork. Examples from the vault made the deception tangible. A church memo noted Brother Augustine transferred due to pastoral needs. Another, written the same month, recorded a private settlement with the family of a child he had harmed. A royal ledger referenced resolution of succession uncertainty, while an adjacent file described the poisoning of a prince. A medical report spoke of experimental treatment on unclaimed subjects. The same terminology used elsewhere to describe lethal tests on the poor. This was not random obfuscation. It was coordinated. One vault document, an unsigned memorandum from the late 1300s, outlined principles of prudent record-keeping. It warned against explicit language and advised maintaining a balance between honesty and ambiguity. The record must be true, yet never transparent. Training materials revealed how deeply embedded this culture had become. New scribes were taught how to write about sensitive matters without ever naming them. They memorized key phrases and their safe equivalents. One manual instructed, "Every event may be stated twice, once for God, once for men. The first in truth, the second in discretion." The phrase indiscretion appeared so often across documents that it became almost a creed. Some officials, perhaps fearing their own system's opacity, created personal keys, private notebooks, translating euphemisms back into plain language. One such notebook listed over 100 terms, with annotations like resolve equals silence, internal correction or threat, and for the peace of all or burial. These private glossaries confirmed that even insiders needed guides to navigate the web of concealment they had inherited. The vault's final text on this subject was chillingly self-aware. It was titled "On the Preservation of Order," a guide for disposing of sensitive records without leaving gaps in the archives. It instructed how to replace destroyed documents with neutral substitutes, memos confirming completion of review or fulfillment of duty. Its closing line captured the ethos of centuries of silence. Records must remain whole, even when truth is not. The language of concealment was the mortar holding power together, its grammar built on fear, its syntax on control. Through these phrases, centuries of wrongdoing were not erased, but translated, transformed into administrative routine. And as the historians realized, it wasn't the absence of records that kept secrets buried. It was their presence, the illusion of transparency masking the architecture of silence. The next revelation would expose that architecture in physical form. Vaults, sealed archives, and networks designed not to store knowledge, but to bury it forever. One position appeared in monastery records for 2 centuries, keeper of special archives. Same title, different people, enormous salary. The vault revealed what special archives meant, everything they wanted future generations to never see. For most of history, the existence of such a profession was unrecorded. Archivists, scribes, and secretaries appeared in public accounts, their duties described in bland administrative terms. But the vault's documents peeled back that facade. Beneath every institution, the church, royal courts, medical guilds, there existed a parallel chain of command dedicated not to preserving truth, but to managing it. These were the secret keepers, the custodians of silence. Their task was to protect the institution's most dangerous knowledge, its crimes, its failures, its contradictions. And they did so with a precision that bordered on devotion. Job descriptions from the vault describe the position in cautious phrasing: custodian of restricted matters, overseer of confidential inventories, or simply curator of discretion. Their pay was unusually high, often triple that of ordinary scribes, and their contracts contained unusual clauses. No correspondence regarding duties shall be permitted. One document read, "The nature of this office is to be unspoken, even in confession." The hiring criteria were equally revealing. Letters between abbots and royal chancellors discussed candidates not for skill, but for loyalty and vulnerability. One recommendation praised a clerk's timid disposition and family obligations. Another noted an applicant's debt that ensures gratitude. Loyalty was best secured through leverage. The network they served was vast. The Prague Vault, it turned out, was not an anomaly, but one node among many. References to mirror archives appeared in correspondence from France, Spain, and the Italian city-states. Each location had its own custodian, responsible for maintaining both secrecy and uniformity. The system was hierarchical. Some keepers oversaw only a single vault, others coordinated regional concealment. The documents describing their methods read like early intelligence manuals. Keys to restricted rooms were split into halves, held by two separate individuals who could open nothing alone. Archive maps used coded coordinates, false corridors, and decoy chambers constructed to mislead intruders. One file even described dummy archives, filled with harmless records designed to satisfy inspectors' curiosity. The secret keeper's correspondence was sparse but revealing. A monastery archivist named Brother Mathieu served 40 years in silence, his letters to family never mentioning his real work. After his death, an entry in the monastery's journal simply read, "The custodian fulfilled his vow and now sleeps among the faithful." The contents of his vault were not touched for another century. Another figure, a royal secretary named Alvaro de Rojas, appeared in both Spanish and French records. Officially, he managed diplomatic correspondence. In truth, he coordinated cover-ups between courts, ensuring scandalous materials were redirected or destroyed. His handwriting appears in documents from multiple kingdoms, always under different titles. One note, preserved in the vault, contained his guiding principle: unity of narrative sustains peace. Perhaps the most haunting role belonged to a church official linked directly to the Peccata Silentium Index. His title, Cleric of Internal Order, disguised his true function: guardian of the secret collection that inspired the Prague Vault itself. His surviving instructions included rotation of forbidden texts, ensuring no document remained in one location long enough to be discovered. The vault also preserved contingency plans, protocols for moments when exposure threatened, lists of which documents to destroy first, which to relocate, which to falsify. There were codes for communication in crisis. The garden requires pruning, meant burn the files. The harvest is complete, meant transfer complete. These systems were efficient but deeply human. Among the records lay glimpses of the people who maintained them. Small notes in the margins, prayers written between lists of procedures. One keeper scrawled, "To preserve silence is to share guilt." Another wrote simply, "May God forgive what I protect." Some appeared proud of their role. A report from 1458 praised a retiring custodian for ensuring 4 decades of institutional peace. Others carried the tone of exhaustion. One letter unsigned read, "I have lived among ghosts of truth. Their company is heavy." The vault even documented succession rituals. Senior secret keepers trained replacements through coded instruction, passing on not only methods, but mindset. They described the role as both burden and calling. One of the most poignant documents recovered was a farewell letter from an aging keeper to his successor. You will learn to speak in silence, to write without meaning, to destroy what must not live. It will isolate you. Trust only the order, not yourself. The peace you preserve will never thank you, but you must keep it still. His handwriting faltered near the end, as though even the ink carried weariness. Beneath the signature, he added one final line: guard the vault, and may it never need to be opened. For centuries, men like him ensured that it never was. But as the historians pieced together this invisible fraternity, one realization became clear. These keepers were not anomalies. They were the quiet infrastructure of every powerful system, a lineage of silence passed from one generation to the next. And while individuals could die with their secrets, institutions learned how to make secrecy immortal. The next section would reveal how the policies, hierarchies, and procedures that transformed concealment from an act into an administrative doctrine. A bishop's budget for 1378 included line items for vestments, candles, building repairs, and silencing costs, with a note, estimate based on prior 3-year average. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was an expectation. As the vault's documents revealed, concealment wasn't an exceptional response to crisis. It was part of the regular bureaucratic function of medieval institutions. These organizations didn't just manage information, they managed deception, systematically, professionally, and as routine procedure. The vault's most disturbing insight came when the historians discovered formalized policies, detailing how to handle sensitive situations. These weren't emergency plans drawn up in the heat of scandal. They were protocols, step-by-step guides for managing and suppressing misconduct. The documents included procedural manuals outlining how to contain scandals. Immediate actions involved removing principals from public view, securing witnesses, and controlling the narrative. Medium-term strategies focused on relocating involved parties, crafting alternative explanations, and managing documentation. Long-term protocols included monitoring the situation, refreshing cover stories, and planning for future contingencies. Even more shocking were the standardized forms, templates for documenting scandals. These weren't generic forms. They were designed to conceal, not reveal. Different types of offenses had predetermined cover-up procedures. The system was so efficient, it became an institutional competency. Administrators were evaluated not just on their ability to manage resources, but on their skill at managing sensitive situations. Training manuals and correspondence revealed that new administrators were often shocked when they first encountered the extent of institutional concealment. However, over time, they learned to see it as a necessary function, one that ensured stability and protected the institution's reputation. The vault held letters between mentors and mentees, with older officials coaching the younger on the subtleties of suppression. The more visible the scandal, the more discreet the solution must be. Even the financial structure supported this culture of concealment. Documents showed budget allocations for discretionary management and sensitive situation resolution. These were explicit line items in annual budgets, funds set aside for managing cover-ups. One particularly striking example was a church budget from 1412, which included anticipated concealment costs, calculated based on previous year's scandals. These estimates were not a rare afterthought. They were integrated into the core financial planning. The normalization of concealment didn't just involve money. It became a measure of institutional effectiveness. Records from royal courts and medical guilds revealed that audit committees reviewed the effectiveness of suppression tactics. Institutions didn't merely hope scandals would stay hidden. They evaluated how well their concealment systems worked and optimized them over time. What emerged from these documents was a professional community dedicated to information suppression. Officials shared best practices in concealment with one another, offering advice on the most effective cover stories for different types of scandals. One document from a Parisian church official to a colleague in Milan included a list of tactics for handling accusations against clergy, advising deflect by focusing on broader moral issues, and recast blame on external factors like political instability. The vault's most unsettling document was a budget report from 1450, detailing projected costs for the year. The standard expenses, salaries, supplies, maintenance, were present, but there was also a new category: anticipated concealment costs, based on averages from prior years. This wasn't an anomaly, it was routine planning. Institutions didn't just expect wrongdoing, they prepared for it. By the time these systems were uncovered, the vault's contents made one thing clear: secrecy wasn't an aberration, it was built into the structure of power. Deception had been institutionalized, rendered so ordinary that its cost was as predictable as the price of candles and repairs. As the historians pieced together the documents, they realized that this culture of concealment was both a mechanism and a mindset. But what drove it? Why did these systems of deception thrive for centuries without disruption? The answer would lie not in the mechanics of secrecy itself, but in the moral and theological justifications that allowed these cover-ups to persist without question. The next chapter would explore the deep, philosophical tensions that made concealment a standard operating procedure rather than a moral violation. One bishop's private writings explained his documentation. "I deceive men for the church's sake, but I will not deceive God. Let him judge from complete record what I dared not let men see." This line encapsulates a profound paradox at the heart of the vault's contents. While medieval institutions went to great lengths to conceal their misdeeds from public scrutiny, they felt an inescapable theological imperative to document everything for God's eyes alone. It wasn't that they failed to recognize the moral weight of their actions. Rather, it was their belief in divine judgment that forced them to preserve the truth. Medieval theology was rooted in the conviction that nothing could be hidden from God. Every sin, every deceit, every failure of virtue would ultimately be exposed at the final judgment. The vault contained numerous theological documents that discussed this belief in detail. To these officials, attempting to destroy records wasn't just imprudent, it was heretical. Destroying the truth from human eyes might protect their reputations, but it would only hide it from those who had no power over their eternal souls. In a series of letters between church officials, the tension became clear. Some argued that the act of documenting for God's eyes alone was necessary to fulfill divine duty. One wrote, "What man may erase, God shall unearth. Better that we write than that we be found liars." Another insisted, "Let not our secrecy here deny the clarity of God's will. Let all be recorded that his judgment may be true." Others debated the necessity of keeping these records minimal or coded. "For the sake of salvation," one letter read, "let us preserve, but with as few details as necessary. To God, the truth need not be so elaborate. These theological concerns led directly to the creation of the vault itself. The archive was not a record of proud accomplishments or successful governance. It was, for many, a repository of mandatory confession. One manuscript, dated 1432, explained the role of secret documentation. Not for man, but for God, we write. These shall be our confession, for we dare not appear before him with false tongues. This document was written in the margin of a letter describing a cover-up, an event involving a senior church figure whose transgressions had been concealed. Despite the institutional efforts to protect his reputation, the writer was aware that his actions, both the concealment and the documentation of it, were being recorded for the divine, not human judgment. Marginal notes in the vault documents illustrated this psychological struggle. Some scribes asked for divine forgiveness in the midst of cataloguing scandal. "Forgive me, Lord, for I must suppress this. But I leave it before you," one note read. Another confessed, "The truth is recorded here, though it is not for men to see. Let your judgment be true." These notes weren't written as expressions of guilt, but as a form of spiritual accounting, admitting the reality of their actions while asserting that only God had the right to ultimately judge them. This theological justification grew out of the belief that temporal authority, earthly law, could be bent or manipulated, but divine law was inescapable. One document read, "Though the law of men may excuse, God will not pardon." Another from a royal official spoke plainly, "What is done in secret is known in heaven. The church protects its flock, but before God all is revealed." The idea was that maintaining a public fiction, especially for the sake of institutional power, was acceptable as long as the truth was preserved for God's judgment. The theology of documentation not only permitted this behavior, it rationalized it. The notion that the institution's reputation could be saved while maintaining an honest record for God provided a framework in which deception was both a practical necessity and a spiritual obligation. Some church officials even rationalized the act of concealing actions from men as a form of protection for the faithful. The church must appear perfect, that the faith may endure, but the truth shall be kept safe for the Lord's eyes. As historians uncovered more records, it became clear that this belief in divine judgment drove officials to document their wrongdoings with a chilling sense of responsibility. One letter from a senior church official said simply, "I dare not leave this unrecorded, lest I be found guilty before God." It wasn't that they didn't recognize the immorality of their actions. They simply saw their obligation to document as the only way to preserve their salvation. What's perhaps most striking about these revelations is the psychological complexity they reveal. These were not cold, calculating individuals acting out of pure malice. They were deeply embedded in a system that merged faith, power, and secrecy there. Their actions were shaped by genuine belief in divine judgment, making their concealment of sin an act of both calculation and reverence. The next chapter will explore the more earthly motivations for maintaining these records, how documentation served as a form of leverage and insurance within institutional power structures. One archive contained identical copies of a scandal report in 3 different collections. Marginal notes on each explained, "for protection." They'd documented each other's sins, so no one could expose anyone without mutual destruction. By this point in the vault's exploration, it became clear the archive was more than an act of piety or fear of divine judgment. it was also a survival mechanism, an intricate network of leverage woven through letters, ledgers, and sealed confessions. In the world of medieval power, truth was not merely preserved for God. It was currency. It was insurance. And when necessary, it was a weapon. Correspondence between churchmen, nobles, and royal administrators revealed a quiet understanding. Documentation was protection. A letter from a bishop to his subordinate put it bluntly: keep record of all that passes your eyes. Should they turn upon you, you will hold the mirror they dare not face. The subordinate replied with equal pragmatism: I have done as advised. Our peace lies in mutual knowledge. This principle of mutual assured documentation was the backbone of institutional equilibrium. Each participant in wrongdoing held evidence of others' participation. No one could expose another without destroying themselves. Letters between high-ranking officials expressed reassurance in this mutual dependency. We are bound not by the oath but by record. Thus, silence is safe. The vault's examples were strikingly specific. One bishop who oversaw embezzled funds kept detailed records of his superiors' misappropriations. When accused years later of financial mismanagement, he presented a sealed packet of correspondence proving the wrongdoing had been ordered from above. The charges vanished. He retired comfortably, his devotion and diligence publicly praised. A monastery treasurer followed a similar strategy. He maintained secret ledgers of bribes and indulgence sales, complete with names of buyers and recipients. When superiors attempted to remove him for improprieties, he revealed the existence, not the content, of his records. His position was immediately renewed. Marginal notes on his documents carried the phrase, "for my safety." Even in royal courts, the same dynamic played out. A trusted advisor to a French monarch kept private copies of assassination orders, each countersigned by courtiers now eager to forget. Through 3 regime changes, he remained untouched. His final entry, written in careful script, read, "The secret of my survival is that I know theirs." These records reveal an entire political ecosystem built on equilibrium of fear. Each participant's protection depended on the knowledge that others held equal or greater incrimination. The vault's documents showed that this system wasn't merely tolerated, it was cultivated. Some letters explicitly recommended distributing sensitive copies across different archives. One directive read, "Keep one with the abbey, one with the chancellor, one with the keeper of discretion." Truth divided, this truth preserved. Ironically, this redundancy ensured that centuries later, enough fragments survived to reconstruct the system itself. The practice extended into succession planning. Outgoing officials briefed their successors not only on duties, but on ongoing concealments. Manuals included sections titled "Continuity of Sensitive Matters." The idea was simple. To maintain stability, the new custodian had to inherit the old secrets intact. One letter of transfer between bishops included a list of matters best left unresolved with attached documentation. At the end, the departing bishop wrote, "Knowledge of these ensures your peace, as mine was ensured." These archives also served as institutional memory. When past scandals resurfaced, administrators consulted previous records to ensure new explanations aligned with old ones. One correspondence noted referred to the account of 1324. The story then proved sufficient. modify only the names, and in this way, truth became an administrative resource, something to be referenced, adjusted, never erased. Economically, secrets had measurable value. Their worth depended on the power of those they implicated and the freshness of the information. A scandal involving a living cardinal or noble could secure enormous concessions. A decade-old affair, by contrast, held only nostalgic power. One particularly revealing ledger tracked value of recorded indiscretions, like inventory. Each entry listing a person, event, and estimated leverage potential. Some records even show that documentation was used as a deterrent. Officials allowed hints of damning material to circulate without revealing its content. The mere knowledge that such evidence existed kept rivals compliant. A note from a court scribe described this tactic with disarming simplicity. We need not unsheathe truth, only show its scabbard. The vault contained one of the most remarkable examples of this dynamic. A nobleman's will written in 1398. It included sealed packets labeled for trusted allies. His instructions read, "If my heirs are betrayed by the houses of R or L, open the enclosures marked in their names. The truth will defend the bloodline when swords cannot." His death made his archive into a weapon that could be wielded across generations. In the end, the vault wasn't just a repository of sin. It was a ledger of power. Documentation created equilibrium, an invisible contract that replaced trust with deterrence. Every official knew that survival depended not on innocence, but on possession of proof. As the historians pieced together these relationships, they began to understand why the vault endured. Its purpose was not merely confession to God or duty to posterity. It was structural necessity, a record that protected the powerful from one another, as much as from judgment. And yet, buried among the pragmatic correspondences and strategic ledgers, there were a few voices that hinted at something else, a belief that truth, though dangerous, might one day serve redemption rather than control. The next section would explore that final fragile motivation, the hope that someday these records of wrongdoing might help future generations learn what the present refused to face. The vaults in Index began with a dedication. To those who discover this, whether in 10 years or 1,000, may you be wiser than we were, and forgive what we could not fix. For all its records of manipulation and deceit, the vault contained another, more human layer. Documents written not to conceal, but to confess. Not to protect power, but to warn whoever might someday read them. Scattered among the ledgers and codes were manuscripts addressed to those who come after. Voices reaching across 7 centuries with startling clarity and humility. Historians at first mistook these writings for ordinary reflections or marginal notes. But as they translated them, a pattern emerged. A handful of officials, monks, physicians, minor nobles, had written with a different intent. They were not preserving secrets for leverage or salvation. They were preserving truth as testimony, a message to an imagined future that might learn from the failures they could not escape. One monk's manuscript detailed the relic fraud that enriched his monastery. His tone was neither proud nor defensive. He explained every step of the deception, the crafting of false relics, the orchestration of miracles, the manipulation of pilgrims, then ended with a single line that seemed to speak directly to the present. May wiser ages build faith without lies. A physician's journal followed the same impulse. He recorded his participation in medical experiments that harmed prisoners and the poor, then turned his pen against his own profession. "We cloak cruelty in the name of knowledge," he wrote, "and call it progress. If you who read this live in gentler times, guard your science from pride." His words were addressed to the healers yet unborn. Another document came from a minor nobleman who had witnessed political murders in his court. His account was part confession, part philosophical reflection. "Power," he wrote, "is a sickness that feeds on silence. We call our cowardice loyalty, our fear prudence. If there be a future where truth may speak without dying, let this serve it." These manuscripts read like moral time capsules, attempts to explain how systems of deceit functioned, why they persisted, and what might have prevented them. They revealed writers who recognized corruption but saw themselves powerless to stop it. Some wrote with guilt, others with resignation, yet all shared a fragile faith that humanity might eventually improve. "The ages turn," one note read, "and perhaps mercy will increase as knowledge does." The most moving revelation came from the compiler believed to have overseen the Peccata Silentium archive itself. In a final letter, written in trembling script, he described spending decades gathering evidence of institutional sins, not to condemn individuals, but to leave a record for redemption. "I could not cleanse the house I served," he confessed, "but I could leave a lantern for those who will enter it after the darkness." His letter closed with a haunting reflection. "We wrote so God would know, but perhaps it is men who must read. Let this stand as witness, not of what we hid, but of what we hoped might be healed." Reading those words, modern historians felt the strange weight of connection, the realization that we are the audience those long-dead voices imagined. Their belief in wiser ages feels both humbling and uncomfortable, as if the vault's rediscovery is not triumph, but test. The vault was never meant to glorify secrecy. It was meant to preserve conscience. Its creators buried truth not to erase it, but to deliver it forward, trusting that someday someone might understand. And now, centuries later, their gamble has succeeded. The voices they feared to raise in life speak again, asking the same question that echoes through every age. Will we be wiser than they were, or only more discreet? The next chapter follows the thread they left behind, how this hidden archive survived the centuries, and what its accidental rediscovery reveals about the fragility of truth itself. The vault's internal log recorded every threat to its survival. The last entry, from 1962, read, "I am dying. I told no one. God forgive me, but perhaps some secrets should die with their keepers." He didn't destroy it. He simply forgot to pass it on. For 7 centuries, the vault existed on the knife edge of discovery and destruction. Its survival was not the result of divine providence or institutional foresight, but a chain of small coincidences, narrow escapes, and human decisions, some deliberate, some careless, all essential. Among the vault's many documents, one bound volume stood apart, a chronicle maintained by successive keepers. It wasn't theological or administrative, it was a record of near disasters. Each entry began with a date and a terse description of the danger faced, followed by the keeper's response. Together, they read like a centuries-long heartbeat, steady but fragile. The first major threat came in 1421, when a fire tore through the monastery above. Flames consumed libraries, dormitories, and the refectory. According to the log, molten lead from the roof collapsed into the crypts below. The keeper at the time noted simply, "Smoke seeped downward, but not flame. The door holds." When the site was rebuilt, the vault's entrance was sealed further behind new stonework, its location unintentionally obscured by reconstruction. A century later, in 1543, the vault nearly resurfaced. Renovation plans included expanding the cellars to create storage for wine and grain. The log recorded the crisis in understated Latin. "Surveyors approached too near. I redirected them toward the eastern wall. Additional masonry laid." Later correspondence revealed how the keeper accomplished this redirection by bribing laborers with church funds and claiming structural instability in the western foundations. The vault remained untouched, sealed behind superstition and expense. The religious conflicts of the 1600s posed an even greater threat. As Europe fractured between Protestant and Catholic powers, monasteries were plundered and archives destroyed. Yet the vault survived precisely because almost no one knew it existed. The few who did considered revelation too dangerous. One keeper wrote during the 30 Years' War, "Better heresy above than truth below, I pray no one remembers." When reformers demanded inventories of ecclesiastical holdings, the vault was omitted entirely. Its invisibility was its armor. The 1730s brought a quieter brush with exposure. A Jesuit historian researching early monastic architecture uncovered references to special archives in a now missing ledger. He wrote to local clergy requesting access to the lower chambers. The reply, preserved in the vault's log, dismissed the claim as legend. No such chambers remain after the fire of old. The historian accepted the explanation, noting in his diary likely confusion with catacombs. His curiosity ended there. In the 1850s, another near discovery came closer still. A Czech antiquarian named Václav Dornel studied structural drawings of the monastery and deduced a discrepancy, an unaccounted void beneath the chapel floor. He petitioned to excavate, but church officials denied permission, citing concerns for sacred integrity. The log noted that a local priest, himself unaware of the vault's true nature, was instructed to stall indefinitely. Donald died in 1807, never knowing how close he'd come. The 20th century brought dangers of another kind. During the Second World War, Prague endured heavy bombing. The monastery above was hit in 1944. Several upper chambers collapsed. The log's entry from that year is written in a trembling hand. "The earth shook, dust fell like ash, but the door remains. God keep it sealed." The next entry, from 1948, mentions Soviet occupation and requisition of religious properties. The keeper wrote, "The new master's inventory all. I claim the lower vault flooded and unsafe." He sealed it further with debris, marking its entrance as condemned for stability. By the mid-20th century, the institutional memory of the vault had eroded almost completely. The last known keeper, a reclusive brother named Antonin, served quietly from the 1930s until his death in 1962. His final entry, written in fading ink, reads, "There is no one to follow. I told no one. Perhaps it is best forgotten." His death ended the unbroken chain of custodians that had protected the vault since the 14th century. For 6 decades afterward, the chamber lay dormant, not preserved through vigilance, but through neglect. In hindsight, It's astonishing how many chances history had to erase it. Fires, wars, reforms, reconstructions. Each might have destroyed or revealed it. Yet each passed, leaving the chamber untouched. Its protection came not from fortresses or faith, but from coincidence and obscurity too. One historian who examined the log remarked that the vault's survival was the perfect metaphor for truth itself, too fragile to defend, yet too stubborn to vanish. The keepers who once guarded it did so out of fear, duty, or blind habit. Later generations protected it by simply not knowing it existed. By the late 1900s, the vault was no longer a secret. It was a void. The monastery above continued its life as a historical site, unaware of what lay beneath its foundations. The door that had survived fire, war, and reform now slept behind centuries of stone and dust, waiting for accident, not intention, to bring it to light. And in February 2024, that accident finally came. The construction worker who found it was about to knock off for the day. He later said he almost left the wall for tomorrow's crew. One choice made differently, and the vault might still be sealed right now. It was February 14th, 2024, an unremarkable Wednesday in Prague. The monastery above the vault had long since been deconsecrated and sold to developers planning to convert the aging structure into luxury apartments. Permits had been approved, architectural surveys completed, and the renovation crews were deep into the early demolition phase. For months, workers had been clearing centuries of debris, uncovering old cellars and forgotten storerooms. Nothing unusual, until 3:47 p.m. Tomasz Nowak, a 42-year-old construction worker from Brno, was working in a lower basement that once stored maintenance equipment. He described the air as thick with dust and lime, the smell of damp plaster clinging to everything. The task was simple. Remove a cracked internal wall that the engineers had marked as non-structural. He raised his crowbar, struck the plaster once and heard a sound that didn't belong there. A hollow metallic echo. At first, he thought it was old piping. The monastery had been rewired and replumbed several times across the centuries. Stray metal wasn't unusual. But when he struck again, the sound deepened, dense, deliberate. He called to a co-worker. Together, they scraped back a section of plaster, revealing iron. Rusted, but unmistakably shaped. A seam. A hinge. The site supervisor, impatient to keep to schedule, initially dismissed it. Probably old reinforcement, he told them. But when Novak insisted the surface was too uniform, too crafted, the supervisor finally agreed to remove a bit more. By 4:15, the outline of a door had emerged, thick iron bands over ancient wood, sealed beneath layers of hardened wax. Someone took a photo. It made its way up the management chain to the property owner, who forwarded it to a friend, an amateur historian at Charles University. Within an hour, she was on site, flashlight in hand. She took one look at the ironwork and whispered, "Medieval." By early evening, the city's Cultural Preservation Authority had arrived. Work halted. The basement, once loud with drills and laughter, fell silent. The crew stood behind cordon tape as the experts examined the door. It was unlike anything they'd ever encountered. Perfectly preserved hardware, seals intact, the surrounding stone undisturbed. Someone muttered that it felt like opening a tomb. At 9:30 that night, under the dim light of portable lamps, a small team assembled. 3 historians, 2 conservation specialists, and 1 videographer to document the process. Every motion was deliberate. They photographed the wax seals before softening them with controlled heat. The seals, once the color of dried blood, bore faint impressions of unfamiliar symbols, neither strictly ecclesiastical nor heraldic, something older. When the final bolt gave way, the sound was barely audible. A soft sigh, as if the air itself had been waiting. The first draft that escaped was dry and cold, tinged with dust but strangely clean. One historian later described it as the smell of parchment preserved by centuries of silence. They shone their lights into the darkness. What they saw silenced everyone. The chamber extended far beyond what the blueprints suggested. A vaulted room carved directly into the rock, lined with shelves. The shelves held hundreds of leather-bound volumes, each meticulously ordered, each untouched by time. The first document they lifted was remarkably intact. Its cover bore only 2 Latin words, etched in faded ink that had darkened with age. Peccata silentium. Sins of silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the historians, a woman named Helena Vavra, who would later lead the preservation effort, breathed out a quiet laugh of disbelief. "We're standing inside history," she said. By midnight, word had spread quietly through academic circles. Authorities secured the site, setting up temporary environmental controls to preserve the chamber. The documents were too fragile to move yet, so the historians worked in shifts, reading, photographing, and translating under soft light. Every few pages, someone would exhale sharply, as if recognizing what they had just uncovered. They soon realized this was no simple archive. These were original records, letters, financial accounts, theological treatises, all cross-referenced, all deliberately hidden. The implications were staggering. In those first hours, the team worked in a kind of reverent daze. No one wanted to leave. They ordered coffee, set up cots, and stayed through the night, reading until their eyes blurred. At dawn, one of them stepped outside, blinking at the cold February light, and whispered, "They buried their truth here, and we've just unearthed it." The vault that had survived 7 centuries of fires, wars, and forgetfulness had finally spoken, not through miracles or prophecy, but through the accident of a tired man deciding to swing his crowbar one more time. By morning, the world above continued as always, cars, trams, the noise of Prague awakening, while below, a door that had waited 700 years stood open for the first time. And with it, the silence that had protected history for centuries began to unravel. Between the vault's discovery and public announcement were 9 months of silence. Not for conservation reasons, for political ones. Some institutions wanted these secrets sealed again. They lost. When the vault was first opened in February 2024, the initial consensus among the historians and preservationists on site was simple. The contents must be made public. The documents had been hidden for 7 centuries, precisely because power had feared exposure. To conceal them again, even temporarily, felt like repeating history. But almost immediately, other voices began to intervene. Within days, officials from the Catholic Church requested access to preliminary findings. Their argument was measured. Historical transparency was important, But interpretation required careful curation. Without proper context, they warned, centuries-old documents could confuse the faithful or distort understanding of the Church's moral evolution. Behind the diplomatic phrasing was a clear message: release nothing until it could be managed. Government officials had their own concerns. Prague's tourism industry relied heavily on its image as a city of art, faith, and mystery, not scandal. One ministry advisor reportedly asked whether the discovery could be contextualized as a localized anomaly rather than a reflection of wider European practices. Meanwhile, academic institutions competed for control over research rights, citing the need for structured analysis before publication. The first open disagreement came in March, during a closed-door meeting between historians, preservation specialists, and representatives from the Church and Czech Cultural Ministry. The scholars argued that the vault's very purpose, preserving truth despite suppression, demanded immediate disclosure. One of them, Dr. Helena Vavra, is said to have asked, "If we hide it again, what lesson do we learn?" Over the following months, pressures mounted. Legal experts debated ownership. The documents had been sealed before modern property law, their creators long dead. Did they belong to the church, the state, or the private developer who technically owned the building? Preservation specialists, caught between politics and principle, warned that the materials were too fragile for handling, yet too significant for secrecy. Some argued for slow, deliberate study, others for open access regardless of condition. Behind the scenes, more aggressive tactics appeared. Church lawyers proposed classifying the manuscripts as sacred artifacts, which would legally transfer custody to Vatican archives. Government officials floated moving the materials to a secure cultural repository outside Prague. A leaked memo even suggested invoking national heritage laws to restrict access until interpretive frameworks are agreed upon. In response, an unlikely coalition formed. Historians, journalists, and civil libertarians joined forces, backed by several Czech parliament members who recognized the political risk of censorship. Their argument was simple and powerful. Secrecy had already shaped history once. Allowing modern institutions to control the narrative would make them complicit in the same centuries-old deceit the vault exposed. The standoff lasted 9 months. During that time, the public knew nothing. Work continued quietly under strict confidentiality. Cataloguing, scanning, stabilizing fragile parchment. But every report, every photograph, was classified as internal reference only. For nearly a year, history sat behind another locked door. Then, in November 2024, compromise was reached. The vault's contents would remain in Prague under joint supervision of Czech cultural authorities and an independent academic council. Conservation and digitization would proceed simultaneously, ensuring full preservation. Public release would be phased, with each set of documents accompanied by scholarly annotation, but with one inviolable clause: nothing could be withheld permanently. When the discovery was finally announced, the reaction was immediate and global. The story spread across continents within days. For the first time in history, the truths once buried for divine eyes and institutional safety were accessible to everyone. The fight over history had ended much as it had begun, with fear and control meeting their limits. The vault survived centuries of fire, war, and silence. It survived its own rediscovery too. Now, the doors that stayed closed for 700 years are open. not just in stone, but in spirit. The next chapter explores why that matters. What these ancient scandals, preserved through secrecy and faith, reveal about the enduring patterns of power that still define our world today. Every type of institution in the vault, church, government, medical, social, faced the same question when scandals emerged. How do we protect ourselves? Not one asked, how do we make this right? That, more than any single event or revelation, was the vault's defining pattern. Whether the subject was clerical abuse, political murder, medical exploitation, or social hypocrisy, every document pointed to the same instinct. When confronted with wrongdoing, institutions closed ranks. Their reflex was not moral reflection, but containment. The vault's correspondence revealed this pattern with chilling consistency. When confronted by exposure, officials across centuries asked identical questions. What damage may follow? Who must be moved? What narrative will restore trust? The absence of one question, what is just, was not coincidence. It reflected the underlying logic of institutional thinking. The belief that the organization's survival and the faith it inspired in others mattered more than the truth. One letter from a 14th century bishop defending concealment captured this rationale perfectly. If the church be stained, all souls suffer. Better a lie to protect the vessel than truth to sink it. Another from a royal advisor echoed the same reasoning centuries later. The realm cannot be ruled by confession. Order demands silence. The psychology behind these words is both unsettling and understandable. Medieval officials did not necessarily see themselves as villains. They believed their institutions served divine or societal purposes so essential that any admission of corruption risked endangering civilization itself. In their minds, deception was a necessary sacrifice to preserve the greater good. This logic permeated every layer of administration. In the church, concealing immoral clergy was rationalized as protecting faith itself. In government, suppressing evidence of assassination or intrigue was justified as maintaining political stability. In medicine, hiding failed or unethical experiments was seen as preserving public trust in healing. The pattern transcended profession or era. It was systemic, cultural, almost instinctive. One royal memorandum captured the internal calculus behind such decisions. Truth cannot serve the living if it destroys belief in authority. Another, from a monastic record, declared, "Justice must yield when scandal endangers the flock." These phrases recur so often in the vault's materials that they seem less like excuses and more like doctrine. The tragedy is that these justifications produced the very harm they sought to prevent. Protecting abusive clergy allowed further abuse. Concealing political crimes ensured repetition. Suppressing medical malpractice delayed reform. The vault contained letters where officials acknowledged these consequences and still prioritized preservation. One physician wrote to a colleague, "Exposure would destroy the guild. Better that a few perish than that healing itself be doubted." Another, from a royal archivist, admitted, "We bury crime so the crown may endure, though it ensures new crimes will follow." The documents reveal a civilization more aware of its own corruption than history often admits. Its leaders understood the moral cost of their choices but accepted it as the price of order. In that sense, the vault is less a record of hypocrisy than of fear. The fear that if institutions lost their appearance of sanctity, society itself would collapse. And yet, the pattern endures. Modern readers will recognize the same logic, repeated in different forms. Corporations hiding failures to protect shareholder confidence. Governments suppressing misconduct to preserve public trust. Organizations prioritizing reputation over accountability. The vocabulary changes, the structures evolve, but the instinct remains identical. This continuity reveals a difficult truth about human systems. Once an institution defines itself as essential, it begins to treat truth as conditional. Transparency becomes a risk, justice a luxury, morality a calculation. The vault's documents show how easily self-preservation replaces service as the highest duty. In one sense, this reflex makes survival possible. In another, it makes integrity impossible. The medieval church believed it was preserving faith. Monarchies believed they were preserving order. Medical guilds believed they were preserving progress. And in every case, what they preserved was power. That is why institutional reform, even today, remains so elusive. The problem is not merely corruption or greed. It is culture. Those inside the system come to see themselves as custodians of something larger than truth, and thus exempt from its full demands. The vault's lesson is stark but essential. When institutions forget that they exist to serve humanity, they begin to believe humanity exists to serve them. And as the next section will reveal, that belief didn't only protect institutions, it also defined who suffered under them. The vault documents institutions, claiming to protect the vulnerable. The same documents show them systematically exploiting those same populations. The protection was the access point for exploitation. Across every category of the archive, religious, political, medical, and social, the same pattern emerged. Those with the least power bore the greatest burden. They were taxed, tested, disciplined, and deceived by the very systems that claimed to defend them. In the logic of medieval institutions, vulnerability wasn't a problem to solve. It was a resource to manage. Religious authorities turned faith into extraction. The relic trade revealed in the vault showed how the poor were sold fragments of salvation they could barely afford, while the wealthy received them as gifts. The documents detailed pricing structures. One manuscript noted, "The humble pay in hope what nobles pay in favor." Pilgrims mortgaged homes and land to purchase blessings they believed could cure disease or secure redemption. The priests who sold them often wrote afterward of merciful gain. Political systems functioned no differently. The same kings and lords who spoke of protecting the common folk routinely sacrificed them in wars, construction projects, and conspiracies. The vault included conscription records, listing thousands of peasants sent to fortify borders, while noble families' sons remained exempt. In one letter, a regional commander admitted, "It is better the poor die building walls than the nobles die behind them." Medicine, too, preyed on the powerless. The experiments chronicled in the vault revealed not isolated cruelty, but a philosophy of disposability. Prisoners, orphans, and the poor were test subjects for treatments later sold to wealthy patrons. One physician wrote, "We must learn upon those who can be spared." Another claimed that the suffering of the condemned purified the science that would one day heal the righteous. Even the mechanisms of justice reflected this imbalance. The vault's court records showed two legal systems coexisting within one society. Commoners were flogged, mutilated, or executed for crimes that brought nobles only fines or temporary exile. A magistrate's note summarized the rationale with chilling brevity. Severity maintains order among the low. Mercy preserves dignity among the high. These documents revealed not isolated corruption, but institutional consensus. The people in power understood perfectly what they were doing. They saw the poor, the sick, and the powerless not as citizens or souls, but as assets, sources of income, labor, information, and control. The vulnerable were useful because they lacked the means to resist. And once exploited, their continued poverty and dependence made them useful again. The rationalizations were sophisticated. Theology reframed suffering as spiritual currency. Pain on earth purified the soul, making exploitation appear as sanctified service. Economic theory argued that stability depended on hierarchy. Some lives had to carry the weight so that others could advance. Medicine claimed its abuses served the greater good, a phrase appearing so often in the vault that it might as well have been institutional scripture. Each field developed its own moral grammar to justify cruelty. And yet, within the same pages, voices of dissent appeared. A friar wrote anonymously to his bishop condemning relic extortion. "You have turned the prayers of the poor into coin." A young magistrate argued for equal punishment regardless of rank and was quietly reassigned to a distant province. A physician's apprentice refused to assist in experiments on prisoners and vanished from subsequent records. These brief flashes of conscience showed that exploitation was not invisible. It was simply suppressed. The pattern sustained itself because exploitation reinforced vulnerability. Those drained of wealth by false relics became poorer still, more dependent on the church. Those crippled by forced labor or unsafe medical trials became easier to control. Power fed on weakness, then cited weakness as proof of divine or natural order. The vault contained an unnerving phrase, repeated in multiple documents. The poor are God's instruments. Their suffering sustains the world. It is tempting to see such thinking as medieval delusion, but the parallels are uncomfortably familiar. Modern societies still exploit the powerless in subtler ways, profiting from their labor, experimenting on their health, enforcing laws that punish them most severely. The language has changed, but the logic remains. Those least able to resist remain easiest to use. The vault forces a grim recognition. Institutions that claim to serve the vulnerable often do so because vulnerability grants access to loyalty, to labor, to silence. Control disguised as care has always been the most effective form of domination. One historian studying the vault's medical papers summed it up starkly. They didn't exploit the poor, despite their mission to protect them. They exploited them because their mission made it possible. The documents show that every era finds new justifications for the same behavior. Medieval theology spoke of divine order. Modern systems speak of economics, efficiency, or necessity. The vocabulary shifts, the victims change, but the structure endures. And that structure, where harm becomes habit and injustice masquerades as duty, wasn't sustained by cruelty alone. It was reinforced by something deeper, something far more durable than violence or greed. The normalization of wrongdoing, the quiet transformation of corruption into routine. That is the pattern the next section uncovers, the mechanism that allowed all others to survive. The vault shows how good people do bad things, not through sudden corruption, but through thousands of small compromises, each seemingly justified, until they're defending what they once would have condemned. Across centuries of documents, one truth emerged. Institutions didn't survive by filling themselves with villains. They survived by shaping ordinary people into instruments of preservation. The most dangerous machinery uncovered in the vault wasn't physical at all. It was psychological. Letters, journals, and training manuals revealed how this process unfolded in slow, precise stages. Newly appointed officials entered their roles with sincere conviction. Many expressed shock at what they found. Missing funds, concealed scandals, procedures that contradicted the ideals they'd been taught. Their first reaction was disbelief. Their second was silence. The pressure began gently. Mentors advising patience. Colleagues urging discretion. Reminders that every institution has its shadows. Then came the rationalizations. It's not your place to question precedent. You'll understand once you've served longer. The language itself became part of the transformation. Euphemisms softened wrongdoing into mere irregularities, sensitive matters, or administrative necessities. The words built moral distance. Actions that might have seemed unthinkable outside the institution became almost routine within it. The vault's documents showed this pattern with haunting regularity. In one monastery's correspondence, a young abbot wrote of his discomfort with financial manipulation. A year later, the same man approved similar practices, explaining that responsibility sometimes requires burdens. By the decade's end, he was teaching others the same logic that had once disturbed him. Hierarchy amplified this effect. Authority was divided across so many levels that no single person felt responsible. The bishop who approved transfers blamed the abbot who proposed them. The abbot blamed the scribe who wrote them. The scribe blamed obedience to orders. Diffusion of responsibility made collective guilt feel like no guilt at all. Cultural conditioning completed the process. Loyalty was reframed as morality. Obedience as virtue. Questioning authority became synonymous with betrayal. The vault's training texts for administrators emphasized harmony and continuity above conscience, warning that public dissent could injure faith or undermine order. Over time, preserving the institution's image replaced preserving its principles. Economic and social incentives reinforced the conversion. Promotions favored those who proved trustworthy by keeping quiet. Whistleblowers found themselves reassigned, discredited, or erased. The system rewarded conformity and punished integrity so consistently that morality itself began to feel naive. What makes these records chilling is how self-aware many participants were. They wrote openly about their discomfort, then rationalized it away in the next line. One royal clerk confessed, "Each silence weighs less than the last." Another wrote, "At first, I excused one lie for peace. Now I excuse peace for lies." The vault contained hundreds of such small self-eulogies. The moral erosion of individuals who once meant well. The brilliance of this machinery was its subtlety. No single person planned it, yet it operated with mechanical precision. By redefining virtue as loyalty, it turned conscience into threat. By fragmenting accountability, it made honesty impractical. By embedding corruption in routine, it made reform seem impossible. And the system sustained itself. Those who had been reshaped became its architects, training their successors to inherit both their duties and their blindness. Manuals from later centuries reveal how normalized this had become. Case studies describing how to manage moral tension not by addressing it, but by absorbing it. The vault preserved one line that distilled the entire ethos. A good servant must carry guilt lightly, or he cannot serve long. Still, resistance existed. Some refused to bend. Their letters are brief and final, records of dismissal, exile, or death. Yet even their presence proves that the machinery was never total. It worked not by erasing morality, but by exhausting it. Reading these documents, the modern historian can trace the architecture of institutional corruption across centuries. It does not require evil, only structure. It begins with language, flows through hierarchy, feeds on fear, and ends with self-justification. And if this machinery feels familiar, it's because it never stopped running. Modern institutions, corporate, governmental, religious, still rely on the same mechanisms: euphemism, hierarchy, loyalty, reward. Systems built to maintain stability inevitably manufacture conformity. And once people confuse obedience with goodness, the rest takes care of itself. That is the vault's final warning. Most of the people who sustained centuries of deception weren't monsters, they were us, given the wrong incentives and the right excuses. Understanding that may be the only way to prevent history's oldest machinery from turning again. They sealed the truth for 700 years. It stayed sealed for 700 years. But here's what they didn't fully grasp. Eventually, all sealed things are opened. Truth has patience that institutions lack. The vault's existence is more than a historical accident. It's a statement about the persistence of truth itself. Every effort to suppress its contents also ensured their survival. Every layer of concealment became a layer of preservation. The very institutions that sought to erase their sins became the instruments of their endurance. The irony is almost cosmic. What began as an act of concealment became an act of testimony. Those who built the vault believed they were protecting the church, the crown, and the established order from scandal. Yet by choosing to document rather than destroy, they preserved the evidence of their own corruption. What they intended as secrecy became history's confession. That irony reaches deeper still. The vault's creators justified their secrecy through theology. They believed God would someday judge all things, and that truth must therefore be recorded for his eyes. But it wasn't divine revelation that uncovered their archive. It was a construction crew, bureaucracy, an accident. The judgment they expected from heaven arrived through paperwork and dust. The truth waited patiently, and when time and circumstance aligned, it stepped quietly back into the world. The vault's 7th century journey tells us something essential about information and power. Control is never absolute. Suppression may last decades, centuries even. But time erodes authority faster than it erases memory. Regimes change, technologies that shift, values evolve, and what once demanded silence eventually finds voice. Power is finite. Truth endures. The difference between medieval concealment and modern revelation isn't morality. It's circumstance. Human nature remains unchanged, still fearful, vicious, self-protective. But the conditions have transformed. In the 14th century, knowledge could be sealed behind stone and wax. Today, information replicates endlessly. The digitization of the vault's contents guarantees what even its builders could not: permanence beyond control. Once scanned, copied, and archived across networks, No institution, religious, political, or corporate, can bury it again. The truth they tried to hide for 700 years now exists in servers and backups, immune to fire, theft, or decree. Still, its survival was never inevitable. The vault's history is a fragile chain of accidents, fires that burned everything except the room beneath, renovations halted by rumor, wars that destroyed libraries but missed one sealed door. It survived because enough people made choices, some moral, some fearful, that cumulatively preserved it. In the calculus of history, truth doesn't win by strength, but by attrition. Falsehood exhausts itself, concealment decays. Can this be generalized? Do all secrets eventually surface, given time? Or was this vault an anomaly? A survivor of coincidence rather than cosmic justice? The evidence suggests both. Some truths vanish forever with their witnesses. Others, like this one, endure through neglect rather than intent. But the pattern holds. Power can suppress truth for a time. It cannot erase it completely. The force that sustained deception, fear, loyalty, interest, are temporary. The materials that carry truth, stone, parchment, code, are surprisingly durable. And so we are left with uncomfortable questions. What secrets buried in our own time will emerge centuries from now? What archives of deceit are being compiled today, preserved by the same logic of protection and fear? What will future generations discover about us? What we tolerated, what we justified, what we chose not to see? The vault's keepers likely suspected discovery was possible. Some even hoped for it. Their decision to record instead of destroy suggests faith, not in institutional salvation, but in eventual reckoning. They didn't trust their contemporaries to face the truth. They trusted time. That is the vault's final irony and its quiet triumph. Truth does not rush. It waits, hidden in stone, sealed in wax, encrypted in memory. It endures until circumstance or conscience unseals it. Institutions collapse, languages fade, empires dissolve. But the record remains, whispering through centuries, I am still here. The vault's survival reminds us that truth's half-life is longer than any reign or ideology. It can be delayed, distorted, denied, but never permanently destroyed. And now, as those forgotten words circulate freely across the world, the question is no longer whether truth survives. It's whether we can bear what it reveals when it finally does. The vault exposes medieval institutions doing terrible things that everyone now agrees were wrong. It also shows medieval people who recognized these patterns and couldn't stop them. We should consider we might be those people. After every revelation, one question remains. Does truth change anything? Or does it simply join the record, another entry in history's long catalogue of human self-awareness without transformation? The vault itself offers a sobering precedent. Medieval institutions documented their own corruption, sometimes in great detail. Officials confessed, philosophers warned, dissenters protested. They weren't blind. They knew what they were doing. And yet, the patterns continued for centuries. Awareness alone did not create reform. The same paradox confronts us now. In 2024, as the vault's contents became public, commentators hailed it as a reckoning with history. Yet, reading its pages, one can't escape the uneasy realization that these patterns never truly vanished. They merely changed vocabulary. Institutions still protect themselves first. Vulnerable people still bear disproportionate costs. Whistleblowers still face retaliation. Well-intentioned individuals still adapt to systems that quietly reshape their morality. The vault becomes mirror, not monument. It reflects not only what medieval institutions were, but what all institutions risk becoming. History shows that information alone rarely changes power. The vault's writers knew the truth, and so did their contemporaries. Some even spoke it aloud, only to be silenced or ignored. The problem was never ignorance. It was the collision between knowledge and self-interest. When truth threatens stability, systems adapt to absorb it. The vault's own existence proves that awareness can coexist with inertia. Modern parallels abound, scandals exposed, inquiries conducted, reports filed, and yet the mechanisms that enable corruption persist. Transparency becomes ritual rather than remedy. Each revelation sparks outrage, investigation, apology, and gradual forgetting. The vault warns us that revelation without structural change is simply confession without repentance. So the uncomfortable question is not whether we will uncover more hidden truths. We will. It's whether those truths will alter the machinery that produces them. Will historians in 2125 look back on this moment as the point when institutions became accountable, or simply as the point when we recognized the problem yet again and still failed to solve it? The answers, if they exist, lie in how societies respond to discomfort. Optimists argue that each exposure, however delayed, builds cumulative pressure, that transparency over time becomes irreversible. Pessimists counter that institutions adapt faster than reforms can bind them, evolving new forms of concealment and justification. The pragmatists say both are right. Knowledge is necessary, but insufficient. Change demands sustained attention, not just revelation. What would it take for the vault's lessons to matter? It would require rethinking how power works at every level, designing systems where transparency is default, not exception, rewarding moral courage instead of loyalty, creating accountability mechanisms that don't depend on the conscience of individuals already trapped inside the system. It would mean replacing cultures of secrecy with ones that view truth not as threat but as oxygen. Yet history suggests why that's so hard. The same structural incentives that shaped medieval corruption still operate. Fear of scandal still outweighs desire for honesty. Institutions still equate criticism with disloyalty. Individuals still rationalize compromise for the sake of order. And most of us, when confronted with moral discomfort, still prefer silence to conflict. That may be the vault's most disquieting message. These patterns persist not because we don't recognize them, but because we do and find them tolerable. The machinery of corruption runs not on malice, but on acquiescence. Each small decision to look away becomes a brick in the wall that hides the truth. So what, then, is the vault's real legacy? Perhaps not the end of corruption or the reform of institutions, but the gift of recognition, the vocabulary to describe how power manipulates conscience, the evidence to prove that resistance has always existed, and the reminder that silence is never neutral. The vault shows us that exposure alone doesn't redeem systems, but it can redeem individuals, one act of honesty at a time. It's tempting to believe we would have acted differently than the people who built this vault. But they also believed that of those before them. The question is not whether the truth survives. It always does. The question is whether we change before it has to wait another 700 years to be heard. The vault stayed sealed for 700 years because no one forced it open. Now it's open because someone finally did. That's the choice in every era. Force truth into light, or let it stay buried. The vault's lesson is that choice matters. The vault cannot undo what was done. It cannot heal those who suffered, prevent every future abuse of power, or offer a simple remedy for complex systems. But it does give us something enduring, a pattern recognition tool, a language for vigilance, a historical warning label printed across time. It teaches us what corruption looks like from the inside, how it talks, how it hides, and how it survives. If there is one thing to carry forward, it is the ability to recognize when institutional preservation begins to replace institutional purpose. When procedure becomes defense, when loyalty outweighs conscience, when euphemisms replace honesty, the machinery has already begun to turn. The vault gives us the vocabulary to name that process while it's still forming, rather than after it's complete. Its documents offer a kind of early warning system. We know the signs now. Soft phrases that disguise wrongdoing, hierarchies that blur accountability, the gradual normalization of compromise. We know how systems justify exploiting the powerless and how ordinary people rationalize their complicity. The vault lets us trace every mechanism of moral corrosion, not as history's pathology, but as a living pattern we can still interrupt. It also gives validation to those who resist. The letters from medieval whistleblowers and dissenters, monks, physicians, clerks, show they weren't naive. Their discomfort wasn't misplaced. They saw clearly what others chose not to see. Their warnings were ignored then, but the vault itself vindicates them now. Every document preserved in defiance of silence proves that resistance, even when futile in the short term, matters in the long run. So what do we do with that knowledge? The vault suggests practical answers. Document truth, even when no one listens. Speak, even when silence seems safer. Create networks that protect integrity rather than conformity. Understand how your own role, however small, can either perpetuate or challenge the system around you. The people who preserved the vault's contents were not powerful reformers. They were record keepers, scribes, archivists. Their courage wasn't in defeating corruption, but in ensuring it could never fully erase itself. That, perhaps, is our modern task. We are all potential archivists of our own age. What we choose to preserve, or to ignore, will shape how future generations judge us. When they uncover our archives, our data, our correspondence, what will they see? That we recognize the patterns and acted, or that we recognize them and adapted? The vault changes how we understand history. Medieval people were not ignorant of corruption. They were entangled in it, constrained by structures too strong for them to reform. Some documented, some resisted, most endured. Future historians may say the same of us. They may find our records, emails, policies, reports, and recognize the same struggle. The tension between moral clarity and institutional inertia. So the vault's final lesson is neither comfort nor despair. It's recognition. Institutions tend by their nature towards self-preservation over truth, protection of power over justice, and normalization of wrongdoing over accountability. This is not a flaw unique to the past. It's an ongoing challenge built into any system that holds authority. Awareness alone cannot stop it, but ignorance guarantees it continues. The vault cannot give us closure, only questions sharpened by centuries. Are we preserving or suppressing truth? Protecting the powerful or the vulnerable? Compromising for comfort or resisting for conscience? Every era faces these choices, and ours is no different. As the camera returns to the vault, its shelves empty now, its secrets dispersed, we see that what was once a chamber of silence has become something else entirely. A mirror. In its reflection is both our history and our warning. The vault was sealed by fear and opened by accident. What we do next will not be accidental, because the truth, once unearthed, doesn't just belong to history. It belongs to us, and to whatever future waits, patient as stone, for the doors we've yet to open.